Chapter 2683. Just like the chaos layer where the fated heaven and earth were located, it was constructed from an endless amount of fated heaven and earth. The communication layer was perfected bit by countless true sages using their own methods. Its size was not something that ordinary worlds could compare to. Just like that, it was clear that every layer of the primal chaos wasn't just a simple world. Although, in theory, a world seemed to be enough to open up a special layer in the state of chaos. The Great Calamity's simulation of the chaos layer had obviously simulated this point. At this moment, in Luo Fan's eyes, the countless worlds that appeared everywhere in the simulated primal chaos state were obviously existing in the true primal chaos state. The galaxies were very likely to be the many worlds that had gathered to form a certain layer. These worlds that converged to form a certain level might not follow the same worldview, but they definitely had some kind of extremely close connection. In fact, it was possible that after some fundamental transformation, many worldviews could be replaced with each other. In this case, the standpoint of those worlds was naturally the same. In other words, if the founder of a world could not explain the new world that had appeared, it meant that the founders of other worlds would most likely not be able to explain it either. In this way, it would naturally cause them to be bound by a common hatred for the enemy. With this thought in mind, Luo Fan soon realized that his enemy was probably much stronger than he had imagined. However, even though he knew that the enemy was stronger than he had imagined, he did not feel any fear because of this. Instead, he became full of fighting spirit. Let me see what level my worldview is at. This thought emerged from the bottom of his heart. At this moment, all kinds of wonderful creatures began to be born in Luo Fan's world of laws. As soon as these creatures were born, they began to destroy everything in this world of laws, trying their best to destroy this world of laws. As soon as these creatures that could destroy everything appeared in this world of laws, Luo Fan knew that the enemy had made a move. With a slight thought, these creatures that were purely destructive were completely erased. He was the creator of this world, and he was also the foundation of this world. Everything in this world was under his absolute control. Even if he wanted to destroy the entire world, it would only be a matter of a thought to him, let alone erasing those living beings. In the blink of an eye, the world became clear again. Even the areas that had been destroyed by the pure destructive beings had completely recovered. Everything looked the same as before. However, as everything returned to normal, even more beings of pure destruction appeared out of thin air in this part of the world. Furthermore, there were more species of them than before, and every single one of them was stronger than before. How did it appear? Luo Fan couldn't help but be surprised. The first time they appeared, it could be said that he was distracted by observing the stars in the sky. He might have misunderstood the way they appeared, but there was nothing much to say about it. However, this time, he was wholeheartedly paying attention to this world. He had seen the entire process of these creatures being born. However, even though he had seen the way these creatures appeared, he couldn't understand how they appeared at all. It felt as if the world was destined to give birth to these creatures at this time. He couldn't find the source of any abnormalities, nor could he figure out how they came to be. However, they were bound to come out. How could he not be shocked? With a slight thought, he erased most of the creatures, leaving only a small portion in front of him. He began to carefully study their composition. These creatures all had different appearances. There was no common form at all. It could be said that any two creatures looked completely different. In fact, there was no such thing as a similar pure destruction creature in this world. One must know that although they had just been born, there were billions of pure destruction creatures that were born in this world every time they were born. Among so many creatures, there were actually no two creatures that looked the same. This was enough to show how chaotic the creatures were. However, although their appearances were messy, their essence was still traceable. Luo Fan carefully sensed these creatures that he had specially left behind and searched for their source. These creatures were extremely peculiar. Other than the extremely small and invisible parts, almost everything came from his world of laws. After seeing this clearly, Luo Fan made a prompt decision to throw away more than 99% of the parts that came from this part of the world, leaving behind the extremely small, invisible part. Then he magnified it in his eyes and began to further search for the source of this invisible existence. As the source of this world of laws and the creator of this world of laws, the things that Luo Fan could do in this world were far beyond the imagination of any living creature. It could be said that in this world, there were only things that he hadn't noticed, and there were no things that he couldn't figure out after noticing them. It was the same for the tiny, invisible existences that came from outside this world. As he focused his attention on it, he soon figured out the source of these invisible existences. It was the repulsive effect of the stars in the sky on this world of laws. So there's still such a way. After discovering the essence of these tiny, invisible existences, his eyes lit up, and he felt that a whole new world had opened up in front of him. Originally, he was still thinking that although the simulated state of chaos was only a simulation of the state of chaos, the isolation effect on other living creatures was not reduced at all. Under such circumstances, different worlds could probably only see each other from afar, and then target each other through the mutual repulsion between the worlds. He still couldn't think of any way to cross worlds and attack other worlds. However, he didn't expect that in the end, the creators of other worlds would actually make an issue out of the mutual repulsion between different worlds. Through this invisible and incorporeal repulsion mechanism that couldn't even be considered a force and could only be regarded as mutual incompatibility at most, they completed the attack on the enemy and the world. This kind of method was an eye-opener for him, and he felt that it was already worth it for him to enter the seventh great calamity. As for the methods of those worlds, they were very simple. They relied on the repulsive effect of different worlds on Luo Fan's world, and treated this repulsive effect as a unit. Then, through some extremely complicated algorithm, these repulsive units were combined and finally formed a complicated, program-like existence. After that, through this program-like existence, they usurped the power, rules, laws, matter, and even other kinds of existences in the enemy world to form various living creatures to attack the enemy and the world. In other words, they treated the repulsive mechanism of a world against the enemy world as a basic unit, such as 0 or 1, and then formed a program through different arrangements and combinations of these zeros and ones. This program was then directly inserted into the enemy world, using the enemy world system to run this program to destroy the enemy world and achieve the goal of using the enemy world's power to destroy the enemy world. This kind of attack method, similar to a hacker, bypassed the originally impassable simulated state of chaos and caused the two worlds that originally couldn't touch to form a confrontation. Of course, these were just the basic principles of this kind of combat mechanism. Just like in the computer industry, zeros and ones could play with each other and even create a virtual world, this kind of more complicated, subtle, and incredible repulsive unit could naturally play with more changes. This kind of transformation into a pure and destructive being was the most common kind of transformation here. There were countless other changes that were more subtle, more obscure, and more inconceivable. Perhaps at this time, Luo Fan's world had already suffered countless attacks that he hadn't discovered yet. Thinking of this, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel horrified. With a slight thought, he began to thoroughly investigate his world, starting from the most fundamental factors to carefully investigate everything in this world, looking for possible attacks that might exist against this world. Fortunately, he was the creator of this world, and also the source of this world's worldview. His mastery and understanding of this world had long reached the level of omniscience. Under his careful investigation, he quickly found tens of thousands of different strange mechanisms formed by the repulsive mechanisms of other worlds. These strange mechanisms were hidden everywhere in his world, exerting influence on his world through various indescribable ways. Although they might not necessarily destroy it, no matter what kind of influence they were obviously hidden dangers to his world. If he didn't pay attention to them, they might erupt at any time, and the result would be that his world would be completely overturned and destroyed. In fact, if the influence was greater, even his worldview might be affected. Once his worldview was affected, the impact wouldn't just be this robbery. Perhaps his entire cultivation process would be affected as well. After understanding this, Luo Fan knew what to do in his heart. Every time he tried to erase these programs, it was obviously not going to work. As the various mechanisms continued to descend, these programs were naturally born continuously. No matter how many times he erased them, as long as the source of those programs existed, in other words, the countless worlds in the sky full of darkness, then no matter how many times these programs were destroyed, they could always be reborn. When the time came, would he have to erase these programs every time they were born? In that case, would he still need to cultivate or think of a way to break out of this situation? Therefore, if he wanted to fight against these programs, he could only rely on the world itself. In other words, he also needed to install a countermeasure program in this part of the world. Only with a countermeasure program would this part of the world take the initiative to resist all invading programs and use its own power to defend against all damage from the outside world. That way, Luo Fan would have time to do other things and would be able to counterattack. If he hadn't understood the nature of these programs, it wouldn't have been so easy for Luo Fan to achieve this. At the very least, it couldn't be done without changing his view of the world and without destroying the integrity and balance of his world. After all, if he didn't know the nature of these programs, he could only change the various mechanisms of this world if he wanted to defend against these programs. He could use this change to make these programs useless. If he did this, it was very likely that the perfection of this world would be destroyed and its balance would be destroyed. In the end, it might even cause this world to become incompatible with his worldview. In that case, he might be able to block those programs and prevent those worlds from invading his world through this method. However, from a certain point of view, those worlds had won. After all, the reason why those worlds attacked Luo Fan's world of laws wasn't because they had a grudge against Luo Fan. Instead, it was because the world of laws contained a brand new worldview that might conflict with their worldview. And this kind of conflict could possibly affect their own cultivation. In that case, once Luo Fan changed his world and made it no longer compatible with his worldview and became completely adapted to the countless programs, wouldn't it be equivalent to them assimilating Luo Fan's world? If they could assimilate this world, wouldn't it prove that Luo Fan's worldview was far inferior to their worldview? In that case, Luo Fan would naturally be safe. But at the same time, it would also mean that the creators of those worlds had won. The creators of those worlds were naturally willing to see such an outcome, but Luo Fan wasn't willing to accept it at all. However, this was only in the past. Now that he understood the nature of these programs, he already knew what to do. Chapter 2684. It wasn't a difficult task to install a firewall and antivirus software for this world of laws. Moreover, doing so did not need to fundamentally change the nature of this world. In other words, even if countless firewalls and antivirus software were installed, this world would still be Luo Fan's world of laws. It would still be fundamentally different from any other world and would not lose its uniqueness. The reason why installing antivirus software and installing a firewall seemed to be extremely similar to changing the laws of this world to deal with the various programs that came from the darkness that filled the sky, but the two would result in different results. The reason was actually quite simple. It was like a computer, directly changing this part of the world, causing this part of the world to derive all kinds of mechanisms against those programs was equivalent to directly changing the hardware of this computer, adding all kinds of auxiliary hardware to this computer, and relying on these hardware changes to resist the various programs. In this way, the various programs would certainly be blocked. However, at the same time, after these changes, this computer was no longer the same computer. Perhaps it had already become a kind of deformed monster, an extremely bloated, deformed machine that was full of redundancies. If it was placed in the world of laws, it would naturally cause fundamental changes to the world of laws, causing it to deteriorate countless times. What Luo Fan did at this time was to install all kinds of firewalls and antivirus software on this side of the world, which was equivalent to installing firewalls and antivirus software on a computer in order to deal with external programs. In this case, The changes to this computer were only at the software level. On the hardware level, there were no changes at all. If one were to look at it from the perspective of this world, then it would naturally be that this change was enough to block attacks from the outside. However, the essence of the world itself would not change because of this. This was obviously enough to ensure that this world would always be Luo Fan's world of laws, and its compatibility with him would never decrease. Luo Fan was naturally very clear about the difference between these two choices. It was precisely because of this that he made this decision. As for installing firewalls and antivirus software, it was not too difficult for him. In fact, firewalls and antivirus software sounded very high-end, but they were actually just programs that recorded the appearance of viruses, trojans, and other programs. Once a program with similar characteristics appeared, it would be terminated, isolated, or even deleted. Such a principle was naturally not complicated for Luo Fan at all. At this moment, his heart moved slightly, and the rules and laws in this part of the world all separated out and began to reconstruct themselves according to some indescribable method. They turned into programs and began to circulate endlessly in this part of the world. When these programs were generated, Luo Fan directly integrated the characteristics of all the attacking programs that he had detected just now into them, causing these newly born programs to grasp the characteristics of countless attacking programs as soon as they were born. Immediately afterward, these programs began to disperse and gather on their own. They began to converge toward the negative programs that were generated out of thin air and began to strangle them. Under the strangulation of these targeted programs, the negative programs were all wiped out in the blink of an eye and disappeared without a trace. However, this was just the beginning. The various repulsive forces coming from the black screen were still endless, and the attacking programs formed by the combination of the various repulsive forces were naturally produced continuously. Under such circumstances, the antivirus programs and firewalls that Luo Fan had just created could not relax for even a moment. They were strangling the negative programs at all times. Under such changes, the entire world was constantly filled with all kinds of streams of light that flickered everywhere. These streams of light were extremely mysterious and wonderful. Each of them seemed to contain endless cultivation principles and the mysteries of heaven and earth. It seemed like anyone who grasped this could undergo a tremendous transformation and soar into the sky. However, in fact, these streams of light were the movements leaked by the countless negative programs, or rather, the attacking programs being strangled. It could be said that they were the aftermath of a battle. However, from a certain point of view, it was not wrong to say that these streams of light contained endless cultivation principles and the mysteries of heaven and earth. After all, these negative programs were formed from the rejection of the world of laws by many other worlds through some complex algorithm. Under such circumstances, it naturally contained the profundities of the world, as well as the profundities of the world itself. In Luo Fan's eyes, these mysteries were nothing. However, to ordinary living beings, it was definitely the ultimate truth of cultivation and the profound mysteries of the world. With all the work of fighting against negative programs taken over by the firewall and antivirus software, Luo Fan was idle again. Of course, he only had a little free time. After all, the firewall and antivirus software had just been formed. Although it had absorbed the characteristics of many negative programs he had seen before, it had not been long since the firewall and antivirus software was formed. But in the end, that was only a small part of all the possible negative program characteristics. Who knew when some new negative programs would appear and break through the firewall and antivirus software's defense, causing irreversible consequences? Therefore, at this time, in order to prevent the worst from happening, Luo Fan could only divert some of his attention to pay attention to the situation in this part of the world, so that he could react as quickly as possible and take action to make up for such a situation. However, this did not happen for the time being. The reason was very simple. Luo Fan created an analytical learning mechanism for the firewall and antivirus software, allowing them to have the ability to analyze and learn. Even if the negative programs seemed to have never been seen before, they had their own set of judgment logic to determine whether these programs belonged to the world itself, and then determine what programs they were. Hence, under normal circumstances, there was not much for Luo Fan to do. Unless he really encountered a very exquisite negative program, he generally did not have to do anything. Compared to a truly perfect world, this world was quite broken, but it was still a world after all. As a world, there would naturally be living beings born in it. At this moment, while Luo Fan was resisting the rejection of the world, the living beings in this world began to gradually be born. Due to the colorful lights that filled the sky, once these living beings were born, they seemed to be bathed in the great Tao, and all of them comprehended all kinds of indescribable principles of cultivation. In the end, through these principles of cultivation, they cultivated strength that varied in strength. Some of the powerful living beings had even reached the innate zenith heaven realm. As for the weak ones, they were at least cultivators with extraordinary abilities. The strength of the entire world could be said to be growing at an unimaginable speed. It's a pity that I can't let them attack other worlds. Looking at the countless living beings that were growing at an unimaginable speed, Luo Fan could not help but feel a little regretful. It must be known that these living beings born in the world of laws wanted to cross the simulated state of chaos around them. But it was just like how existences like Luo Fan wanted to cross the real state of chaos. It went without saying how difficult it would be. It could be said that unless they found a special layer of transportation, it would be impossible. Was there a layer of transportation in this simulated state of chaos? It could not be said that there was no such layer, but at least Luo Fan had not seen it yet. Due to these various reasons, although these living beings were getting stronger and stronger, and they were an increasingly powerful force, they could only be suppressed in this world of laws. However, he could only be suppressed in this world of laws. He was unable to attack those worlds and fight for him. After thinking for a while, Luo Fan began to think about how to use the attack methods he had just seen to attack other worlds in the simulated state of chaos. It was not difficult to create a program that could be executed by the world and had all kinds of incredible functions. For an existence at Luo Fan's level, as long as he understood this concept, he only needed to think about it to be able to compile hundreds of millions of exquisite programs that were enough to make the eyes of secular programmers pop out. As for artificial intelligence and virtual reality, it was not a problem for them at all. In fact, the difficulty of creating a program might not be much different from that of the simplest code. However, there was a prerequisite for creating a program. That was, at least 2 different units were needed. Those 2 different units could be treated as 0 and 1. With 0 and 1, all variables needed for any program could be defined, and no matter how complicated the program was, it would be possible to create a program. Of course, in addition to 2 different units, 3, 4, 5, 6, or even countless units could also be created. However, in essence, there was no difference from a 2-unit program. For example, if there were 3 units, each of them could be defined as 2 units. It was the same for 4 units, 10,000 units, or even countless units. The only difference between a multi-unit program and a 2-unit program was probably the efficiency. After all, a 3-unit program had an additional definition compared to a 2-unit program, which greatly simplified some of the extremely complicated definitions of the original 2-unit program. For example, a certain variable that originally needed 2 units to be arranged more than 10 times might only need to be arranged 2 or 3 times to describe it. In this way, the variables that could be described and the changes that could be represented by the same number of fragments would naturally be more than what could be described and represented by 2 units. In this way, the efficiency would naturally be higher. Of course, all of this was just potential. The specifics, of course, depended on the ability of the programmer. The premise of all of this was that there needed to be 2 different units. At the very least, there needed to be 2 different units. If there was only 1 unit, then no matter how heaven-defying the ability of the programmer was, it would definitely be impossible to compile such a unit into a program. The reason why the countless worlds in the darkness were able to compile the rejection mechanism for Luo Fan into a program was not that each of them had two rejection mechanisms for Luo Fan's world. In fact, each world only had one rejection mechanism for Luo Fan's world. The reason why this rejection mechanism could be used to compile an attack program was very simple. It was because those worlds had a tacit understanding with each other. In other words, any attack program or negative program that attacked Luo Fan's world was actually at least the result of the cooperation of two worlds. After a certain two or even multiple worlds communicated with each other, they treated the repulsive mechanism of Luo Fan's world as different units. And then these units were superimposed and combined, finally forming a series of attack programs. Among them, some programs were even the result of the combination of thousands of worlds. That's right, it was the result of the combination of the many worlds inside the galaxies that this world looked at this moment. After all, those worlds could form galaxies, which was equivalent to directly forming a layer in the simulated state of chaos. This also meant that their worldviews were similar to each other, or at least could be replaced by each other through certain changes. In this way, their interests were naturally the same, and there was naturally a basis for cooperation. And the final result of cooperation was the negative programs of Luo Fan's world at this moment. The more units, the more difficult it is to deal with. Perhaps I should first target those programs with fewer units. Looking at the stars in the sky, Luo Fan thought to himself, the more units a program was composed of, the larger the scale of the worlds behind these programs, which meant that if he wanted to deal with those worlds, he would need to target more targets. In contrast, the worlds behind those programs with fewer units were much fewer. In fact, perhaps only two worlds were connected to each other. In this case, which one was easy to deal with? What else was there to say? A world alone can't form a program. Perhaps I should find an ally. Then he thought to himself. Chapter 2685. This place was Luo Fan's seventh Great Tribulation. Everything here was created by the state of chaos to test him. In other words, everything in the simulated state of chaos, including all living beings, all heaven and earth, and all forces, were his enemies. Perhaps he could use all kinds of extraordinary means to make some living beings not take him seriously and not take the initiative to deal with him. However, if he wanted to find an ally that could stand on the same side as him and help him deal with the other heavens and earths, he could forget about it. Therefore, the idea of looking for an ally only appeared in his mind for a short while before he completely destroyed it, leaving no traces behind. Rather than looking for an ally, it was better to think about how to use a unit to form a program to counterattack those heavens and earths. After dispelling all the wishful thinking, Luo Fan felt that his thinking had become clearer. Countless possibilities emerged from the bottom of his heart and were judged one by one from various angles. One possibility after another appeared, and one by one, they were judged to be impossible. Just like that, time passed by slowly. Before he knew it, tens of thousands of years had passed. During these tens of thousands of years, the inspirations he had generated were probably calculated in the trillions. But among so many inspirations, not a single one was actually feasible in the end. At the very least, he alone was able to grasp the loopholes of those trillions of inspirations and completely disintegrate them. During these tens of thousands of years, in his world of laws, the firewall and antivirus software that he had built had already evolved to an incredible level. At every moment, they were fighting against external negative programs. For firewalls and antivirus software, they were being tempered all the time. And being tempered at every moment naturally meant that they were growing at every moment. This kind of growth continued for tens of thousands of years. In the end, both of them had grown and evolved to a level that was unimaginable for Luo Fan in the past. Today, there were still streams of light constantly flickering everywhere in the world. The entire world still looked incomparably gorgeous because of these streams of light. However, compared to the past, the entire world now seemed many times more stable. Back then, the appearance of such streams of light would inevitably bring about some kind of shock. Some kind of shock that directly penetrated into the depths of the world, into the laws, and into the depths of the great Tao. But now, this kind of shock had completely disappeared. At least, on the surface, it seemed to have disappeared. All of the tremors had been erased by the evolved firewalls and antivirus software. Currently, the firewall and antivirus software had already become extremely mysterious existences. They had fused with the entire world and had even given birth to true spirituality, protecting the entire world from an extremely high altitude. In other words, he was in control of this world. Such an existence was very similar to the heavenly Tao in the normal world that Luo Fan had encountered before. The heavenly Tao was not present in every world. However, it was clearly an existence that the heavens and earth could possess. In the past, among the worlds that Luo Fan had encountered, there weren't too many that possessed a heavenly Tao, but there weren't too few either. And in those worlds, the heavenly Taos were like the incarnation of the great Tao, an inferior version of the great Tao. Its authority was similar to the great Tao, although it might not be on the same level. However, compared to the great Tao, the heavenly Tao also had a special characteristic. That is, the heavenly Tao possesses intelligence. It possesses a kind of spirituality that is between the will of the world and the will of living beings. It feels like a kind of spirituality that is born from the will of the world and the will of living beings. And now, the spirituality that was born from the firewall and the antivirus software was like this kind of spirituality. And although the role of the two in this world was not as comprehensive as the heavenly Tao, it faintly already had a hint of the heavenly Tao. This made Luo Fan wonder if the existence that he had seen in the perfect world or the great world might be similar to the firewall or antivirus software that he had built. Of course, this thought only flashed through his mind. For the current him, fighting against this great calamity was clearly the most important thing. In comparison, things like the great world and the perfect world were still too far away from him. At this moment, there were two figures floating in the air around Luo Fan. These two figures were humanoid, but they only had outlines. Apart from the outline, there were no other details. This was obviously the antivirus software and firewall. The main body of the antivirus software and firewall filled the entire world. It could be said that their size had already filled every inch of the void in the entire world. Naturally, what appeared here could not be their main body. In fact, what appeared here was only the spirituality that they had derived from tens of thousands of years of evolution. These two spirituality had turned into the outline of a human. It was not that they had cultivated into a human form, but that the similarity between their spirituality and the wisdom of living beings had reached a certain level, causing the spirituality to instinctively turn into the most obvious representative of the wisdom of living beings, which was the form of Luo Fan. Of course, it was only the outline now, and it could not be seen from the details. For the time being, these two spirituality still had a long way to go. Luo Fan did not care about the appearance of these two spirituality. These two spirituality instinctively got close to him because everything they had came from Luo Fan. At this moment, a thoughtful look flashed in his eyes. The billions of inspirations that he had rejected in the past tens of thousands of years might not have allowed him to find a way to truly counterattack the many worlds. However, this also allowed him to vaguely find a direction. Let's see if this direction will work. With a slight thought, the spirituality of the antivirus software trembled slightly. Immediately after, the flowing light that was constantly shining in the entire world paused slightly. It was as if it had become much dimmer in an instant. With this change, all kinds of indescribable, invisible existences emerged out of thin air in front of Luo Fan. These invisible existences were none other than the attack programs, or rather, negative programs that were formed by the repulsion of the world against the world of laws through a special algorithm. Originally, when these programs appeared, they would inevitably be attacked and blocked by the antivirus software and firewall. Once that happened, these programs would naturally be directly destroyed by the two. The flowing light that filled the sky was born because of this. At this time, because of Luo Fan's will, the antivirus software and firewall did not go all out to attack these negative programs. Instead, they directly severed the connection between these negative programs and the world of laws, so that although these programs were complete, they could no longer play a role. This was like a program that would have no effect on any computer if it was on a CD-ROM. Only when the CD-ROM was read and the program in it was installed in the computer could it run and cause various effects on the computer. At this time, what the antivirus software and firewall did was to directly intercept the program that was about to be installed in the world of laws, directly burn it on a CD-ROM, and send it to Luo Fan. Luo Fan looked at the countless negative programs, and with a slight thought, the many programs collapsed in an instant. All the programs disintegrated and turned into repulsive units again. These repulsive units mixed together as if they had turned into a nebula, twisting and lingering in front of him as if they were trying their best to restore the original appearance of the program. However, they cannot take shape because of the interference of other units. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan raised his hand and waved, and the many units began to reorganize again. The same repulsive forces merged with each other, and in the end, they turned into countless repulsive effects of different worlds that lay quietly in front of him. Compared to the constant turbulence of the many units before, now that all the units had merged with each other, these repulsive mechanisms became lifeless and no longer had any vitality. Looking at this scene, a faint smile suddenly appeared on Luo Fan's face. It seems that this method is feasible. This thought emerged in his mind. If those repulsive mechanisms were separated into segments and turned into individual units, their mutual influence would bestow the units with the ability to move. The separated repulsive mechanisms would tend to converge into a single unit, and if this tendency was distorted, the units would naturally gain vitality. And once they gain vitality, there would be too many things that could be done. With a slight thought, Luo Fan looked outside the world at the countless worlds that were dotted with the boundless sky. The number of worlds was endless, and any one of them was constantly repulsing Luo Fan's world of laws. In other words, there was a repulsive mechanism, and these repulsive mechanisms turned into units and combined with the repulsive units of other worlds. Finally, they formed various negative programs that attacked and destroyed Luo Fan's world of laws. As long as they are not on the same level, there will definitely be differences. And with differences, they will inevitably repel each other. In this case, I should know what to do. Luo Fan thought to himself, and the smile on his face became relaxed. Then, with a slight thought, the many repulsive mechanisms in front of him began to magnify in his eyes. The various details and characteristics were analyzed bit by bit. After analyzing them, he compared them with the many worlds he saw through this world of laws. In just a few days, he had already been able to match each repulsive effect with each world. Of course, this was also due to his accumulation of tens of thousands of years. It was precisely because of the accumulation of tens of thousands of years that he was already extremely familiar with the repulsive effects of the many worlds. At this time, after a slight comparison, the sense of familiarity that he had accumulated in the past burst out, allowing him to match the repulsive effects with those worlds one by one. After matching the repulsive effects with those worlds one by one, Luo Fan quickly selected a world that was only connected with another world to form a negative program. He magnified the repulsive effect of this world on the world of laws to the extreme and completely concealed the repulsive effects of the other worlds. Then, he began to analyze the characteristics of the repulsive effect of this world. He used all his means to investigate the many details that he had only touched a little before, but he didn't really put his heart into analyzing and studying them. It only took him a few days to match the repulsive mechanism of the many worlds with the many worlds one by one. However, it took him nearly 1,000 years to study the repulsive effect of this world on Luo Fan's world of laws. Although the repulsive effect seemed to be just repulsive, in fact, the repulsive effect produced by different worlds was obviously completely different. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to identify which world it came from through this repulsive effect. As for turning different repulsive effects into units to form complex programs, it needed to be built on this foundation. Since the repulsive effect of different worlds was different, it also meant that the repulsive effect contained the characteristics of a certain world. And what Luo Fan did in the past 1,000 years was to analyze the situation of the world that emitted this repulsive effect through the characteristics of this repulsive effect. With so many repulsive effects as a comparison, it was quite troublesome for Luo Fan to achieve this, but it wasn't impossible. Therefore, he spent over 1,000 years to achieve this. After over 1,000 years, the world that this repelling effect corresponded to was no longer a secret to him. However, he had already figured out the general situation. And the effect of figuring out the general situation was that Luo Fan could already clearly know what kind of difference there would be between the repulsive effect of that world and his repulsive effect on any world. This seemed incredible at first glance, but it couldn't be any simpler. Because he had already figured out the general situation of that world, he naturally understood what kind of difference there was between his world of laws and that world. And knowing this difference, he could naturally know where the difference in the repulsive effect caused by this difference was against the same world. Knowing the use of this difference, and knowing this difference meant that the entire simulated chaotic state was no longer an obstacle for Luo Fan. This meant that from now on, it was no longer the many worlds that could attack him, and he couldn't attack other worlds. Chapter 2686. There were obviously two ways for two units to build a larger body. The first was for the two units to cooperate with each other and build a larger body with a common will. The second was for one of the units to actively cooperate with the other, and through this cooperation, build a larger body in an indirect way. Compared to the first method, the second method was naturally much more troublesome, and there were also many more variables. However, it could still achieve its goal in the end. At this time, it was obviously impossible for Luo Fan to find another world to cooperate with him. Everything in this simulated state of chaos was his enemy, his adversary. It was impossible for him to find an ally. Therefore, he could only use it occasionally, which meant that there was only the second method. Fortunately, it turned out that his conditions were sufficient for him to use the second method. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart trembled slightly, and his world of laws had already begun to undergo some subtle changes. There is obviously only one way to adjust the way this world repelled other worlds in this simulated state of chaos, and that was to change the world itself. The only way was to change the world of laws. Through this change, the repulsion between the world of laws and the many other worlds of laws would undergo a certain change. Then, through the corresponding frequency, the repulsion effect would be fixed in a certain corresponding state. The repulsion effect would then be transformed into intermittent units with extremely special empty spaces. If these units appeared alone, they would probably only cause some kind of chaos. However, if they appeared at the same time as the corresponding units of another world, the two would produce an indescribable reaction, and in the end, the two would work together to build some kind of incomparably complicated structure, and finally turn into some kind of negative program that targeted other worlds. The other unit that Luo Fan was currently targeting was obviously the corresponding repulsive effect of the world that he had selected and carefully studied for thousands of years. Along with Luo Fan's changes to the laws of heaven and earth, the effects of the laws of heaven and earth on all the stars in the dark sky had also unknowingly changed. Under this change, the repulsive effect of the many worlds on this world of laws underwent subtle changes. This subtle change was not enough to cut off the repulsive force of the other worlds on the world of laws, and naturally, it was not enough to cut off the countless negative programs that were continuously being born. At most, it would only slightly slow down the rate at which the negative programs were born. However, this change was obviously only a minor change among minor changes. The real change that had a huge impact was none other than the changes that occurred in the many worlds at this moment. At this moment, in all the worlds, the repulsive effect that was originally produced by Luo Fan's world of laws began to break down turning into countless tiny repulsive units that began to disperse on their own. These tiny repulsive units had a tendency to condense into one again. However, this trend was now distorted by a certain invisible rhythm. Under this distortion, the tendency to condense into one again endowed the innumerable units with an indescribable vitality, causing the tiny units of repulsion to carry out indescribably complex actions in many worlds. At the same time, the repulsive effect that was emitted by the world that Luo Fan had chosen had unknowingly resonated with the many repulsive units produced by the world of laws. This resonance caused the repulsive effect to break down and turn into countless tiny repulsive units that began to rush towards the repulsive units of the world of laws and began to combine in an indescribably complex manner with the various units. Under this combination, an inexplicable program began to take shape. Most of these programs were meaningless, but there were also some programs that were complete, effective, and could be run by the world of laws and produce various effects on the world of laws. In most worlds, these meaningful programs had some sort of simulated intelligence. This simulated intelligence automatically judged the world of laws and began to combine the situation of the world of laws to manipulate the repulsive units of the world of laws. Then, it used these repulsive units to influence the repulsive units of the world that had been selected, making them more complex, orderly, and purposeful. Under this mixture, even more complex and powerful negative programs began to be born and began to destroy those worlds. In Luo Fan's view, the many worlds in the simulated state of chaos were only born because of the descent of his seventh tribulation. At most, only tens of thousands of years had passed. However, for the worlds themselves, it was unknown how many trillions of years had passed in each world. In such a long period of time, they interacted and influenced each other. In the end, the result was that the many worlds had become homogenized to a certain extent. Because of this homogenization, the various negative programs produced by the combination of the many worlds no longer had much effect on the worlds themselves. At the very least, with the various characteristics that the world itself had evolved, it was already enough to ignore the countless negative programs that were derived from the combination of the many units of repulsion. These programs had already appeared in the past billions of years, and they had already been remembered by the world, causing the world to be immune to them. In this way, the tolerance of the worlds for new negative programs, especially those that had never appeared before, was obviously unimaginably poor. At this time, in the face of the negative programs formed by the repulsive units of Luo Fan's world of laws and the repulsive units of another world, the performance of those worlds was quite poor. In the face of these negative programs, those worlds quickly fell into chaos. The laws were disrupted at an extremely fast speed, and even some worlds directly fell into a scene of the end of the world, as if the world would completely collapse in the next moment. Who's helping him? Furious roars reverberated throughout the world. This method of turning the repulsive effect into a unit to form a program was something that the creators of many worlds were extremely familiar with. Therefore, when they saw the negative programs that originated from the world of laws appear in their own world, they immediately knew that there must be another repulsive effect cooperating with it. At least for now, they had not thought that they could use a forceful method to make the repulsive effects of other worlds cooperate with their own. Therefore, to them, the situation at this time was that there was a traitor among them. Although they were worlds derived from the simulated state of chaos constructed during Luo Fan's seventh Great Tribulation, for all the existences in these worlds, they were real and free. All their choices came from themselves, and all their decisions were based on their own interests. Targeting Luo Fan was not a mission instilled in their instincts, but rather the appearance of Luo Fan had touched their interests, so they had such a strong reaction. Under such circumstances, the rejection of Luo Fan in their hearts had unknowingly weakened, and in turn, their resentment towards the traitor had become even stronger. No matter when, no matter what level, traitors were the most hated. Ordinary people could forgive their enemies, but it was difficult to forgive those who were originally on their side, but ultimately betrayed them. Even though the cultivators within this chaotic simulation were not ordinary cultivators, each and every one of them was far stronger than the average cultivator. They were no exception in this regard. The roars reverberated in those worlds, but none of them reached the other worlds. The reason for this was very simple, and it was because they were in a simulated state of chaos at this moment. It was a simulated state of chaos that could isolate all worlds and cut off all connections. They could affect other worlds by relying on the repulsive mechanism between many worlds. In fact, under normal circumstances, even if they had such a repulsive mechanism, it would be difficult for them to affect other worlds. The fact that they could do this was already them turning something rotten into something magical. How could they achieve further direct communication? In a situation where they could not communicate further, they could only speculate about the overall situation based on what they could see at this time. The more they speculated, the stronger the doubts that had long existed in their hearts. The suspicions and apprehensions they had towards the other worlds and the creators of the other worlds would continue to grow and strengthen during this process. In the end, their resentment towards that traitor became even more intense. The many worlds that were originally working together had gradually become estranged because of this. The emergence of this estrangement caused the various negative programs that appeared in the many worlds to produce many flaws that should not have existed. With the appearance of this flaw, the world creators who sensed the existence of this flaw naturally became even more hesitant towards other worlds. After all, the originally seamless cooperation suddenly had many estrangements. No matter how one looked at it, this proved that the world founders were no longer united with each other. Others were no longer of one mind, yet they were pouring out their hearts and lungs. How could such a thing happen to the world's founders? I didn't expect to have such an unexpected harvest. At this moment, Luo Fan had such a thought in his heart, and an inexplicable smile appeared on his face. The flaws of those negative programs naturally appeared in the world of laws. This way, it made it many times easier to deal with antivirus software and firewalls. The entire world seemed to relax in an instant, and the light that was originally everywhere seemed to have decreased by a lot. Of course, this wasn't a good thing for the living beings in the world of laws. The living beings in the world of laws didn't care about the tremors and impacts that the world of laws suffered. To them, the greatest benefit of the world of laws was the ubiquitous streams of light that appeared in this world at all times. To the world of laws, these streams of light were the result of the confrontation between the antivirus software, firewalls, and negative programs. They were the aftermath of the battle, so naturally, the fewer the better. However, to the living beings in the world of laws, these streams of light represented the endless principles of cultivation and the endless mysteries of the universe. To the world of laws, the fewer the aftermath of the battle, the better. However, to the living beings, the more streams of light that could help them comprehend the principles of cultivation and the mysteries of the universe, the better. Therefore, the reduction of the streams of light at this time made all living beings extremely disappointed. However, whether it was for Luo Fan or the spirituality of the antivirus software and firewalls, these were insignificant changes. They naturally wouldn't waste any energy on this. At this moment, Luo Fan's focus was still on the many heavens and lands. At this time, a rift had appeared in the hearts of the world's creators, but to him, this was a rare opportunity. If he could seize this opportunity and truly grasp this advantage, things would be much easier to handle next. At this moment, he used all his strength to manipulate the world of laws, changing the rejection effect between the world of laws and the other worlds through this manipulation and changing the negative programs in the many worlds. Because the pressure brought to him by the external negative programs had decreased a lot, Luo Fan's manipulation of the world of laws became more relaxed, more free, and more refined. In this way, the programs that he could construct in the various worlds became more and more detailed and exquisite. Such a change made the negative program's pressure on the many worlds even stronger, and the destructive effect became even more terrifying. This change made the world's creators no longer have much time to pay attention to anything else. They could only focus their attention on the many negative programs. Chapter 2687. It was precisely because doing so would make the world's founders unable to spare time to deal with other things, so they didn't choose to do so before. Instead, they relied on the world's own reaction to deal with the negative programs that were born because of Luo Fan's world of laws. At this time, the reason why they ignored these restrictions and spent their energy to deal with these negative programs was also very simple, and that was because they all felt lonely at this time. Under the situation of being estranged from the other world's founders, they already felt that they could no longer rely on others, and that they were the only ones who were truly trustworthy. And once they had this thought, they naturally no longer trusted the various programs that they had built in cooperation with the other world's founders. In this way, it was naturally impossible for them to think that they only needed to deal with the negative programs of the world of laws. At this time, they had already placed a lot of their attention on guarding against the negative programs of the other worlds. It was precisely because the number of enemies had increased that they had no choice but to directly deal with these negative programs. Because of this change, although the world's founders were still hostile to Luo Fan's world of laws, they clearly no longer had the mood to pay attention to it. As mentioned before, although it was Luo Fan's seventh Great Tribulation, the many living beings in this Great Tribulation weren't born just to deal with Luo Fan. To them, dealing with Luo Fan was only because Luo Fan had a conflict of interest with them. It was because of the existence of various conflicts of interest that they treated Luo Fan as an enemy and Luo Fan as a powerful opponent. But at this time, when they discovered that it was even more difficult for them to accept their former companions, they naturally wouldn't waste their precious combat power on the world of laws. Faced with such a good opportunity, Luo Fan naturally wouldn't miss it. He began to manipulate the repulsive effect of his world of laws on other worlds without any scruples. He began to experiment with any program algorithms and structure that he could think of that might produce an effect. He transmitted them into the many worlds and directly installed them into the world. He began to operate continuously, causing all kinds of damage to the world, whether it was powerful or powerless. In the beginning, he could only send the changes through the division and distortion of the repulsive units into those parts of the world. As for what changes those programs had experienced in those worlds and what mysteries were hidden in those changes, he had no idea at all. After all, he was separated from the many worlds by an extremely mysterious simulated state of chaos. How could he receive the feedback of those negative programs when he couldn't cross the world of laws at all? However, it was clear that this was only the beginning. As time passed, as Luo Fan's world of laws took effect on more and more worlds, and as more and more stars appeared in the dark sky, he gradually summed up a certain pattern from the negative programs created by Luo Fan through adjustments and probing. Through these patterns, he was finally able to observe the light and shadows of those worlds and get everything that the negative programs he sent out encountered. He even gradually constructed a model of those worlds in his heart. The time he spent to complete this entire process was only a short 100 years. In just a short 100 years, he achieved this achievement that many cultivators in this world couldn't achieve even after spending countless trillions of years. This seemed incredible, but it was actually very normal. This was because although the founders of other worlds had lived in this simulated state of chaos for countless trillions of years, they had also used the negative programs composed of repulsive units to attack other worlds for countless trillions of years. However, when they used these negative programs, the founders of other worlds were also using these negative programs. In other words, the changes in the light and shadows of the world that they saw were not just changes caused by their own negative programs, but changes caused by the negative programs built by countless founders of other worlds. Their negative programs were only an insignificant part of the changes, let alone themselves. Even all the creators of the world in the simulation of chaos would not know what effect they had on the overall changes and what effects they had. Under such circumstances, even if they had hundreds of trillions of years and seen countless changes, the effective feedback they received in the end was extremely little. However, the effective feedback they received in the end was very little. Naturally, it was not enough for them to receive real and effective feedback from such changes. However, at this time, the situation that Luo Fan encountered was completely different. For Luo Fan, in the past 100 years, he was the only one who took the initiative to use the negative programs to deal with those worlds. Apart from him, all the other founders of the worlds focused their attention on their own worlds and the safety of their own worlds. Under such circumstances, although they still instinctively rejected other worlds, they also instinctively formed repulsive units with other worlds to build negative programs to attack other worlds. However, because their own wills did not join in, the changes caused by the various repulsive forces were not much different from before. In other words, if they were purely rejecting other worlds, the entire simulated state of chaos would always maintain its previous stable state. At least, that was the law of change. In this way, for Luo Fan, if he wanted to get the effects of his own negative programs, he only needed to get rid of the original law of the appearances of those worlds. This was a little more complicated than directly observing the results. However, it was only a little more complicated. He did not even need to waste much effort to extract the information he needed. After analyzing the feedback he needed, the simulated state of chaos in front of him underwent subtle changes in Luo Fan's eyes. The darkness that was originally impossible to explore and cross seemed to have a subtle brilliance at this moment. This subtle brilliance spread over the entire black curtain, causing it to faintly appear a little clearer. Of course, although there was some clarity, there was still more darkness. After all, although Luo Fan could already cross the simulated state of chaos and establish communication with other worlds, which could be said to have crossed the barrier of the simulated state of chaos from a certain point of view. However, in reality, this method of his was not a true exchange, nor was it a true leap. Although this communication was enough for him to bypass the barrier of the simulated state of chaos from a certain subtle point of view, from another point of view, or in other words, in reality, the simulated state of chaos still blocked him and prevented him from truly coming into contact with other worlds. And when this obstruction materialized, it was this boundless black screen. At this moment, the boundless darkness was still an obstacle for Luo Fan. However, relatively speaking, it was already many times better than it was at the beginning. This person is starting to have some doubts. Finally, at a certain moment, Luo Fan focused his gaze on a certain place in the boundless darkness, or rather, the location of a certain star. There, he could see that the way the star shone was a little hesitant. This world was none other than the one that Luo Fan had chosen. It was the world that matched the repulsive effect of his world of laws. At this moment, the changes in that world were that after so many years, the creator of the world had gradually discovered the changes in the simulated state of chaos and discovered that his experience was different from the other worlds. All the other worlds apart from him seemed to have encountered some kind of irresistible disaster over the years. The disaster at the beginning was nothing much, but as time passed, the disaster became stronger and stronger, and the manifestation became more and more obvious. Perhaps he couldn't discover it at the beginning, but after all, he was the creator of the world, and there was no problem with his sensitivity. After this process lasted for hundreds of years, it was inevitable that he would discover it. After discovering the difference, he naturally had to find the source. With the ability of the creator of the world, it wasn't difficult for him to find the most crucial information from the countless and complicated information. Therefore, at this moment, he had already vaguely locked onto the possibility that his world was already being controlled by Luo Fan's world of laws. How'd he do it? At this moment, a voice filled with shock and fear rang out from somewhere in that world. However, the one who heard this voice was only the existence that spoke. The living beings in that world weren't strong enough to discover the existence of the Creator, so they naturally couldn't hear the voice of the Creator. Although the creators of other worlds knew of the existence of the creator of this world, they were separated from the creator of this world by a simulated state of chaos. This simulated state of chaos was enough to completely cut off the connection between all cultivators, so it was naturally impossible for them to hear the voice of the creator of this world. However, it was not as if the founders of this world were completely unaware of the changes that might occur in this world. They also knew what the founders of this world might be saying at this moment. Of course, the words that they thought the creator of this world would say were obviously different from what the creator of this world would actually say. In the eyes of those creators, the most likely words that the creator of this world would say would be disdain for them. The reason for this was naturally because the creators of these worlds didn't gain nothing over the years, and they were just working hard to fight against the negative programs that appeared in the worlds that they created. In fact, during this process, they were also analyzing the simulated state of chaos to see which world had betrayed them. With the strength, wisdom, and willpower of these creators, it was only natural for them to be able to obtain results from their research. After all, it had been hundreds of years as they continued their research. They gradually fixed their gazes on the few heavens and earth. Among them, there was this world that Luo Fan had forcefully seized the repulsive unit. For the creators of these worlds, who had been tormented for hundreds of years, there was no longer any room for error to be spared. After locking their gazes on those few worlds, the creators of these worlds decided to let the creators of these worlds have a taste of the consequences of betrayal. Thus, at this moment, they had used what little they had left to target outwards to directly lock onto those few worlds. The many repulsive units regrouped, and with those few worlds as targets, they combined into exquisite and indescribable negative programs that pressed down on those few worlds. Only such a publicly acknowledged traitor could make the creators of these worlds, who had been estranged from each other, unite and attack a certain target together. If it was before, Luo Fan definitely wouldn't be able to tell what they were doing. After all, they were separated from the unbelievable, simulated state of chaos. But evidently, that was only the beginning. After obtaining the feedback from the various heavens and earth through indirect means, his understanding of those heavens and earth had become rather deep. This degree of depth allowed him to see what those worlds were doing at this time with just a glance. But at this moment, Luo Fan made a prompt decision and began to adjust the repulsive effect of his world of laws on other worlds, causing the repulsive units of the countless worlds to gather again, and then seek the repulsive units of other worlds to form negative programs that had never appeared before. These negative programs didn't directly target the world itself, but began to distort the repulsive effect of the world on other worlds. The way the many worlds attacked other worlds was similar to how Luo Fan's world of laws attacked other worlds. They all manipulated their own world and used this manipulation to change the repulsive effect of their own world on other worlds. Through this change, countless repulsive units were divided. These repulsive units were then combined with the repulsive units of other worlds according to a complex algorithm to form various negative programs, or other similar programs. Chapter 2688. Under this distorted effect, the combination of the repulsive effects of the many worlds started to become chaotic. In this chaos, those worlds became more and more powerless to the other worlds. Their communication with the other worlds, as well as indirect communication, was naturally cut off without them realizing it. Faced with such a situation, the creators of the many worlds naturally felt an indescribable sense of loneliness. They could see countless stars in the darkness that filled the sky. However, they could only see those stars. Apart from that, the faint connection they had with those stars had completely disappeared. Faced with this long-lost sense of loneliness, they felt as if they had returned to the past, to the first time they appeared in this simulated state of chaos, and the first time they faced the endless worlds. It must be known that they seemed to be cooperating seamlessly, and they were all on the same side. To Luo Fan, they were all enemies and opponents. However, that was only for now. At the very beginning, when they had just opened up their own worlds in this simulated state of chaos, their fates were not much different from Luo Fan's. They were also rejected by the endless worlds that originally existed in this simulated state of chaos, and they were also corroded and destroyed by the negative programs constructed by the endless worlds. However, in the end, They chose to change themselves and their own worlds. They used their own bodies to respond to the many worlds and to conform to the many worlds' worldviews. Through this method, they achieved balance with the many other worlds and achieved the same benefits as the other worlds. However, this outcome also caused their worldviews to be distorted, and their path forward was cut off. Of course, compared to their own lives, this seemed to be nothing. At this moment, when they felt that their connection with the other worlds had been severed, the creators of the many worlds once again felt the loneliness and fear they had when they had first entered this simulated state of chaos. Apart from two worlds, those two worlds had first appeared in this simulated state of chaos. In this simulated primal chaos state, there were endless worlds, and in Luo Fan's view, these worlds appeared at the same time in the blink of an eye. However, it was clear that the world's founders all had a different understanding of the world. In their minds, the short amount of time that the world appeared in the simulated state of chaos was not the same. Instead, it appeared in an extremely strict sequence. Of course, this order was naturally based on the understanding of the world's founders. For the simulation of the state of chaos, the sequence was obviously meaningless. After all, even though it was only a simulation of the state of chaos, the chaos and uncertainty of time and space still existed. According to the knowledge of countless founders of the world, this simulated state of chaos was definitely the world that had first appeared. The first two worlds that appeared were clearly different from the countless other worlds, because these two worlds were not attacked by the negative program constructed by the previous world. They were the source of the negative programming attacks on other worlds in this simulated state of chaos. To them, the current situation wasn't the same as when they were constructing their own world in the state of chaos. At this moment, he felt the connection between him and the stars in the sky being completely cut off. They fell into a state of unprecedented fear. This kind of fear was many times stronger than the founders of the other worlds. At this moment, the two of them couldn't help but tremble, and the fear in their hearts almost devoured them. As the founders of the world, their world was naturally completely connected to their mood. When their minds changed, they naturally changed the rules and laws of the two worlds and even the great Tao. In just an instant, the two worlds were shrouded by dark clouds. All the living beings in the world instantly felt indescribable fear. This fear made them unable to even stabilize their bodies. Most of them even lost the ability to think. Most of the living beings in the world were directly controlled by their instincts. As they were controlled by their instincts, the two worlds fell into absolute chaos. In just a few short breaths, the two worlds fell into the end of the world. This was a scene of the end of the world. Lightning covered the sky and earth. The world fell, the laws collapsed, and the great Tao was severed. Countless experts who had reached a certain height on the path of cultivation collapsed due to this sudden change and were destroyed in the blink of an eye. Many weaker beings grasped boundless power out of thin air due to this change. With a casual move, they could move mountains and drain seas and destroy the world. This difference was controlled by their instincts, and the end result was the world rapidly collapsing. In just a few short days, most of the two worlds had already collapsed. This change was not limited to the two worlds. In fact, for the founders of the world, the earlier they appeared in the state of chaos, the greater the impact they would receive. The closer the worlds that appeared in the simulated primal chaos were to the two worlds that appeared after the appearance of the two worlds, the more chaotic they were. In this chaos, the destruction of the world would be more complete. The reason for this was very simple. It was because the closer a world was to the birth of the two worlds, the less rejection it would receive when it first appeared in that world. The less rejection they received, the less they would be able to withstand this loneliness and rejection. In this way, the greater the impact they would receive when they fell into this state of loneliness, the more shocking the degree of chaos would be. In Luo Fan's eyes, more and more of the countless worlds within the black curtain began to become dimmer and dimmer. At a certain moment after more than 10 days, there was even a star, or rather, a world that was extinguished forever. As it was extinguished, Luo Fan felt that one of the countless repulsive forces that his world of laws had suffered had completely disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared before. It's over. When he felt the repulsive force disappear completely, Luo Fan couldn't believe what he was feeling. If he didn't know that this feeling couldn't be wrong, he might have thought that the world was using some method that he couldn't understand to attack him. As that world completely disappeared, more and more worlds began to disappear one after another. By the time all the worlds completely stabilized and no longer disappeared, 100 years had already passed. In the end, there were thousands of worlds that disappeared. These worlds felt the most ancient. In other words, they were the first to appear in this simulated state of chaos, the first to cause such strict negative changes in the simulated state of chaos. In the beginning, Luo Fan couldn't believe what he was feeling. He used various methods and spent a lot of effort to probe, search, and sense, but he still couldn't find anything special about it. However, as time passed, as more and more worlds collapsed and disappeared, he gradually believed in his feelings. He truly believed that these worlds had completely disappeared in this simulated state of chaos. After all, if a world could use some method to bypass his perception to deal with him, it would still be possible. However, it was obviously impossible for hundreds of worlds to do so. If Luo Fan did not have this much self-confidence, then he would not have been able to cultivate to this point. In the face of this situation, Luo Fan could only believe that the founders of these worlds were far more fragile than he imagined. What a strange weakness. How can the cultivators who can cultivate to this point be so fragile? After a long time, he could only sigh. At this moment, he truly understood that this was not a simulated state of chaos that truly existed, but a state of chaos that was simulated by the Great Tribulation. If it was a simulated primal chaos that existed somewhere in the state of primal chaos, the creator of the world must have gone through endless trials and tribulations before he could reach this level and create a new world in the simulated primal chaos. Such existences would not be shaken even if they were in a desperate situation. How could they fall into despair just because of this inexplicable feeling of loneliness and ultimately cause their bodies to collapse and be destroyed? Therefore, from this, it could be seen that the founders of these worlds were merely products that had been produced quickly. Their weaknesses were much greater than he had imagined. In that instant, countless thoughts emerged in Luo Fan's mind. The countless worlds in front of him, which he originally couldn't see the point of attack, were no longer as unfathomable as before. With just a slight thought, he had already thought of countless ways to deal with them. As products that had been produced quickly, the founders of these worlds definitely had flaws in their foundations. This flaw was nothing to existences that were weaker than them. With their level, they could easily suppress this flaw, and all thoughts of using them to their advantage would fail. However, for existences that were at the same level as them, this flaw was fatal. Given the strength of existences at the same level, any flaw would be extremely obvious. Any flaw, no matter how small, would be an extremely obvious breakthrough point in their eyes. Therefore, the final result was that the flaws in the foundations of the countless world founders were like completely exposing their weaknesses in front of him in Luo Fan's eyes. It was as if they had directly handed him a knife that could target this weakness. With just a glance, he already had absolute confidence in dealing with all of the world founders. At this moment, he began to change his rejection of the many worlds. With this change, the repulsive effects in the many worlds turned into various repulsive units and began to frantically absorb the endless repulsive units that existed in the surroundings. These repulsive units were kneaded together in an extremely chaotic manner and quickly combined with the repulsive units released by his world of laws, causing countless strange negative programs to be born in the countless worlds at every moment. These newly born negative programs were fundamentally different from the original negative programs. They were no longer like the negative programs from before, each of which was the product of countless designs and modifications. Instead, they were almost random. They were simply created for the sake of the program's formation, and not a single trace of design was put into them. As a result, these programs had all sorts of functions. although most of them were meaningless or negative programs. Because of the many random possibilities, there were actually some positive programs that were born here. After these programs were born, they intertwined with the negative programs and created all sorts of incredible conflicts between them. Amidst the conflicts, all sorts of chaos arose. Due to this chaos, the worlds became increasingly difficult to clean up. At the same time, in those worlds, the world founders all felt an increasing sense of panic emerging from the bottom of their hearts. The situation in front of them was too similar to the countless opposing camps in the endless worlds, and they were using their worlds as battlefields to fight. Once they thought of this, it was easy to imagine how tragic their fates would be. As a battlefield, no matter who won or lost, it could only belong to the losing side, and they would definitely suffer losses. Random programs, meaningless and negative programs were bound to be more numerous. After all, even in science, there was a saying that entropy increases, which meant that all natural evolution tended to be chaotic, and randomness was obviously also a kind of nature. Therefore, the results of randomness were more likely to be meaningless and negative. There were also positive ones, but they were few and far between, and could even be considered miracles. Obviously, in the eyes of many worlds, positive programs were the strength of the existences that were helping them. As for the existences that were helping them, they were actually so weak and weak. It was easy to imagine their estimation of their own future. It could be said that this kind of change had already increased their feelings of despair. Chapter 2689. Under this despair, the situation of their world began to become worse and worse. They spent too much of their energy on countless meaningless programs that don't pose any threat at all. As for the programs that could truly affect their world and cause destruction, they paid much less attention to them. Under such circumstances, it was easy to imagine how the situation of those worlds had changed. Without waiting for Luo Fan to take any further action, just these random programs alone had already caused the appearance of the world to undergo earth-shaking changes, causing the creatures in those worlds to die in large swathes. In addition to the countless ineffective programs that did not cause any fundamental damage to the world, the scenes of the world seemed to have become very different. In the face of such changes, the creators of the world could only control the world they created at all times and try their best to eliminate the impact of the countless programs on the world. Of course, that was because the program was endless and could be produced continuously. Even Luo Fan himself did not know how they were created. Therefore, even if they controlled the world at all times and eliminated the countless programs that were created out of thin air, they could only ensure that the world would return to its original state after the changes, but they could not prevent the changes from happening. In other words, their existence could only ensure that the world could return to its original state after becoming completely different from its original state, but they could not guarantee that the completely different state would not appear again. In addition to the various things that happened before, the light of the world in this world changed, and some even began to flicker as if there were signs of instability. As expected, as long as you grasp the weakness, you can almost do whatever you want. Luo Fan watched all of this in the world of laws with a faint smile on his face. At this moment, if there was an existence that could look at the entire simulated state of chaos from the perspective of a bystander, they would see that in this simulated state of chaos, there were countless stars shining brightly. Only in a seemingly remote corner, there was a star whose light was not only extremely stable, but it was also getting brighter and more dazzling. There were actually signs of it turning into a sun. This was naturally Luo Fan's world of laws. The reason why this world seemed to grow brighter and brighter in the eyes of onlookers was because the existence of this world was gradually standing out and rising above the other worlds in this simulated state of chaos. The increase in the sense of existence was naturally due to the increasing repulsive effects of this world on other worlds. The repulsive effects on other worlds were becoming stronger and stronger. It was like a needle. If it fell on the ground, very few people would notice its existence. However, if this needle was inserted into a person's muscle, then, except for people with necrotic nerves, even a fool would be able to discover the existence of this needle. Now, Luo Fan's world of laws was changing from the original state of falling to the ground to the state of being inserted into his muscles, to the creator of the endless world in the simulated state of chaos. With this change, more and more world founders gradually shifted their gazes from the countless worlds to Luo Fan's world. Although those world founders had such a huge weakness, they were still world founders after all. The problem of their foundation could not make them ignorant and make them completely let go of those incomparably obvious weaknesses. For example, at this moment, in the endless darkness, there was the most abnormal world among the countless worlds. All the stars in the sky were dimming and becoming unstable. However, there was a part of the world that was becoming brighter and more stable. Faintly, there was a feeling that it was going to become the core of all the stars in the sky. How could they not care about such a part of the world? What kind of world is that? At this time, this thought appeared out of nowhere in the minds of countless pioneers of the world. They could vaguely sense that the changes and disasters in their world were probably the source of that world. However, they also understood that that world was their only hope right now. If they wanted to prevent their world from falling into the fate of those worlds that had already been extinguished and destroyed, the only way was to start from the world in front of them and obtain a certain existence from it. And in order to achieve this, they were actually quite clear about what they had to do. In fact, they had already done it once in order to gain a foothold in the simulated state of chaos. At this moment, many worlds began to adjust the essence of their own world and began to actively respond to the countless negative programs that were born out of thin air in their own world. They began to make the laws, great Tao, energy, matter, and even everything else in their own world actively adapt to the negative programs. In other words, they made it so that even if the negative programs were here, they would not be able to cause real damage to the world. This was not a simple process, nor was it a process that could be completed in a short period of time. In the end, it took 1,000 years for a world to truly complete the entire process. When the entire process was completed, a smell that belonged to the laws of that world spread out. At the same time, Luo Fan, who was in the world of laws, suddenly felt that among the stars in the sky, there was a star that suddenly shone brightly. It was originally in the depths of the starry sky, but in the blink of an eye, it had already moved to the side of the world of laws. It had even reached the point where Luo Fan could directly see it even if he used his own eyes to observe in this world of laws. It was as if that world had already become a satellite of the world of laws, changed the essence of the world. At this moment, he suddenly came to a realization and understood what changes had happened to this world of laws. Immediately, with a slight thought, an invisible channel directly connected the world of laws to that world of laws. Then, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. In a flash, he had already arrived outside the world of laws. When he arrived here, the place that was originally pitch black was now filled with some kind of lustrous brilliance. This lustrous brilliance was so wonderful. It was faintly discernible, as if it was real, but also as if it didn't exist at all. As he stood in it, the ground he stepped on was like an extremely stable ground, but also like an extremely illusory illusion. And in the depths of this lustrous brilliance, there was a world there. There was only one world that existed there. Through the lustrous brilliance, he could clearly sense the world and even see the various things within it. It was many times better than the light he could barely see in the world of laws through the perception of the world itself. Immediately, his expression changed. With a light step, his figure flashed, and he crossed the lustrous brilliance between the two worlds, directly arriving outside that world. The moment he arrived, the world began to tremble slightly. The world that was facing him, or rather, the world that was facing him, began to cave in slightly at this moment. It looked as if it couldn't withstand the pressure brought by his existence at all. At this moment, a leisurely sigh came from that world. Fellow Taoist, you're really something. You've only displayed a little, and I have no choice but to take the initiative to change myself to respond to you. It was a woman's voice. It was an extremely beautiful woman's voice. Next, a woman's figure appeared not far in front of Luo Fan. Looking at her appearance, she was in human form. However, compared to ordinary people, her ears were like those of a rabbit, and her fingers weren't like Luo Fan's. Instead, she had as many as 7 fingers on each side. Other than that, the other characteristics of her body were similar to the innate Taoist aptitude that Luo Fan knew. The appearance of this creature was quite in line with the aesthetics of an innate Taoist aptitude like Luo Fan. At first glance, it was quite pleasing to the eye. Hearing her words, Luo Fan just smiled faintly and said, "Since fellow Taoists have decided to change my world long ago, you naturally have to bear the corresponding risks. It can't be that only fellow Taoists want to deal with me without me resisting, right?" The woman smiled bitterly and said, "This is just a test for fellow Taoist. If fellow Taoist wants to join us and gain a foothold in the chaos, you have to be acknowledged by the Forerunners, right? How can this be considered change?" However, Luo Fan's expression was rather calm as he said, "I feel that if you want to be acknowledged by me, you need to be tested by me." Hearing this, the woman's expression froze. She was momentarily speechless. If an ordinary being had said this, it would mean that they didn't know their own limits and actually wanted billions of Forerunners in the chaos to take the initiative to adapt to him. This could no longer be described as arrogance. However, when these words came out of Luo Fan's mouth, especially when he used some small tricks to cause countless Forerunners in the chaos to run for their lives and have no choice but to adapt to his existence, the situation was clearly different. For such an existence, this wasn't boasting or boasting. It was merely stating the truth. Wasn't his appearance here proof of that? Indeed, there's no rule that the minority must be changed by the majority. The woman could only sigh at this moment. "It's great that you can understand." Luo Fan only smiled faintly. "Then, what do you plan to do now? After changing us, what do you plan to do?" The woman asked. "First, I need to connect everyone. We're too lonely here." Luo Fan only smiled faintly and looked up at the endless stars in the sky. Connecting everyone, this is a big project. The woman naturally knew what Luo Fan was referring to when he said that everyone should be connected. He clearly wanted everyone to be like her and take the initiative to change themselves to respond to the Forerunner's understanding of the world and adapt to his worldview. If there were a few people to do this, it naturally wouldn't be too difficult. However, that was only what a few people said. If this number was calculated in the billions and reached the level of all the worlds in the chaos, the situation would clearly be completely different. It wasn't a project that could be completed in tens of thousands of years. It might not even succeed in tens of thousands of years. I don't think it would be too difficult. It should be done in 30,000 years at most. Luo Fan smiled faintly. 30,000 years? The woman's body trembled slightly. She was a Forerunner after all, but she wasn't that kind of ignorant existence. At this moment, she immediately understood what Luo Fan meant. This meant that he had absolute confidence that his methods would be able to prevent the sky and earth from withstanding him for 30,000 years. After 30,000 years, if they didn't change the nature of the world, didn't take the initiative to respond to his world, and didn't take the initiative to change their worldview, then their world would be directly erased and destroyed like the other worlds before them. With that thought, she relaxed again. No matter what, she had temporarily escaped from the quagmire. What happened to the other worlds and the Forerunners of the other worlds no longer had much to do with her. Immediately, her expression became calm again. "I see. In that case, there's still 30,000 years left. Do you have any plans during these 30,000 years? Why don't you come to my world and have a look?" Luo Fan just smiled. I couldn't ask for more. He was indeed quite curious about the worlds that the other Forerunners of the other worlds had opened. Although the world in front of him had been distorted by him and had already taken the initiative to adapt to his worldview, it was still fundamentally another worldview. In the end, there would still be some mysteries of the other worldviews revealed. If he could enter it to have a look and observe, it would be quite useful to satisfy his curiosity. Hearing Luo Fan's words, the woman didn't say anything else. She smiled and waved her hand, and a door appeared on the surface of the world. Through that door, one could see an incomparably vast and mysterious world. In it, one could see everything that the normal world had, as well as all kinds of things that Luo Fan hadn't seen in the normal world before. Chapter 2690. In this world, Luo Fan didn't tour for too long. Although it was a rather interesting world, it was only rather interesting to him. If he were to tour such a world, it would indeed allow him to gain some knowledge and gain some new insights into the world and the world. However, it was only knowledge and comprehension. It was impossible for him to really obtain many irreplaceable truths from that world, nor could he really obtain much nourishment for his world of laws. Therefore, he naturally couldn't stay in it for too long. Furthermore, this world was not the only one that submitted to them. For the many founders of the world in the simulated chaotic state, since they could yield once, it naturally meant that they could yield a second and a third time. Faced with a world of laws that was clearly above the world that they had yielded to, was there a need to say what their choice would be? In this way, in the next few hundred years, the number of worlds that joined the simulated chaotic layer with Luo Fan's world of laws as the core increased in unimaginable speed. In just a short few hundred years, there were already tens of millions of worlds that had joined in. With the addition of these tens of millions of worlds, the simulated chaotic layer that was originally composed of only 2 worlds had truly become a complete simulated chaotic layer. From the perspective of a bystander, one would discover that in the starry sky, where the world of laws was located, the originally lonely world of laws had already gathered into a huge galaxy. It was unknown how many of them were densely packed around the world of laws, making it inexplicably lively. Moreover, this trend still hadn't stopped at this time. With the passage of time, more and more stars began to converge on this galaxy from all over the place, continuously joining this galaxy. This made the galaxy grow stronger and stronger over time, making the starlight in it brighter and more dazzling. As for these newly joined worlds, Luo Fan was initially interested in receiving them one by one and walking through them one by one. However, as time passed, and as more and more worlds joined, he finally gave up on this method after reaching the point where even if he was willing to walk through them, it would probably take him millions or tens of millions of years to walk through them all. As for the newly joined worlds, he generally just expressed his welcome and expressed his intention to let them go. As the galaxy with the world of laws as the core was gradually established, the resources that Luo Fan could use naturally increased. The most obvious was the repulsive effect of the many worlds on other worlds. In the past, when he didn't have allies, he wanted to use this repulsive effect to target other worlds and construct negative programs to destroy them. He could only force the repulsive effect of other worlds to cooperate with him through forceful means. This way, he could achieve his goal and make use of the repulsive effect of a single world to construct negative programs to deal with other worlds. However, it was still extremely inefficient after all. It could be said that in order to achieve the same goal, if there were other repulsive effects that only required 1 unit of energy, then Luo Fan's previous approach would require dozens of units of energy to achieve the same result. This could indeed allow Luo Fan to turn the impossible into possible, allowing him to gain combat power in such a peculiar battle. However, it also greatly slowed down his combat power, making it impossible for him to fully exert his means. As more and more worlds were added to his simulation of the chaotic layer, he no longer needed to continue doing this. For him, he only needed to transmit a thought, and thousands of worlds would actively cooperate. They would actively adjust their repulsive effect on other worlds and construct various repulsive units to cooperate with the repulsive units of the world of laws. This made it many times easier for him to construct a negative program than before. As a result, the programs he constructed were much more exquisite than before. This more exquisite program caused the pressure on other worlds to become stronger and stronger. In fact, the reason why so many worlds changed themselves in such a short period of time and joined Luo Fan's simulation of the chaotic layer of laws was because of this. On this day, a creator of a world came to Luo Fan and asked directly, "Do you really want to do this?" At this moment, Luo Fan's location was outside the world of laws. However, it wasn't a random place. Instead, it was a dojo that had been established outside the law of heaven and earth. This dojo was constructed from the lustrous brilliance that filled the entire simulation of the chaotic layer, and it was filled with the fundamental mysteries of the simulation of the chaotic layer. In this dojo, constructed from the lustrous brilliance, he could clearly sense all the subtle changes in the simulation of the chaotic layer. He could even further comprehend the deeper mysteries of the entire simulation of the chaotic layer through these subtle changes. In contrast, the latter was a more important change. This was because this situation could allow him to be closer to the state of a true sage in the chaotic state. Subsequently, he could understand true sages better. At the very least, he could understand the pursuit of true sages in the chaotic state. One had to know that his current situation in the simulation of the chaotic state was similar to that of a true sage in the chaotic state. At least, in some specific aspects, it was similar. This similar situation allowed him to infer the feelings of some true sages in the chaotic state through analogy, as well as their pursuit. Of course, there was still an incredibly huge gap between Luo Fan and a true sage. Due to this gap, his understanding of a true sage, his guesses, and the pursuit and feelings that a true sage might have were all just guesses. At most, it would only be an approximation on an extremely poor level of precision. It was just like the relationship between classical physics and the real world. Of course, from the perspective of classical physics, one could also know that this kind of approximation was not meaningless. On the contrary, it was extremely significant. It could even be said that it was a necessary path for him to get close to and understand a true sage. Over the years, Luo Fan had actually spent more of his energy on this. He carefully experienced the feeling of being the core of the simulation of the chaotic layer and the various mysteries of the simulated chaotic state that he came into contact with in the simulation of the chaotic state. Through this experience, he faintly had an indescribable feeling. Although he had already constructed the simulated primal chaos layer, the mysteries of the simulated primal chaos state that he had come into contact with were only an insignificant small portion of the entire thing. In fact, saying that it was a drop in the bucket would be an exaggeration. It was precisely because of this that he wanted to start a plan at this time. It was the grandest and most shocking plan that he had come into contact with in the chaotic state back then. This plan was none other than the transportation network that simulated the chaotic state. In other words, he planned to use his current status among the many world founders to unify the strength of the many world founders to build a transportation network for the entire simulated chaotic state and link all the worlds together. For the many worlds in the same layer, this kind of transportation network was actually meaningless. At least, for the world founders, it was meaningless. This was because for the world founders, as long as they were in the same simulation of the chaotic layer, the connection between them would be as convenient as if they were in the same world. As long as they willed it, they could communicate with each other and travel between the many worlds. After all, the connection between the many worlds in the same layer could already be considered a network. However, this was only for the world founders in the simulation of the chaotic layer. For the ordinary living beings in these worlds, this kind of transportation network was extremely significant. Once the transportation network was established, even ordinary cultivators will be able to travel freely between the many worlds as long as they had access to the transportation network. They would be able to travel freely in the simulated state of chaos, as only the food of the creator of the universe could do. Of course, if that was all, it was actually nothing to the world founders. After all, although the world founders cared about their own authority, they were not so petty that they were unwilling to share this authority with the living beings they had created. The reason why the world founders could not accept this was that this transportation network was not limited to this simulation of the chaotic state. Luo Fan clearly wanted to extend this transportation network to the entire simulation of the chaotic state, to all the worlds in the simulation of the chaotic state, and to all the world founders that existed here. This was something they couldn't understand or even accept. Such an outcome seemed to have nothing to do with them and had no impact on them. But in fact, it was equivalent to denying their decision to fade away. It was equivalent to completely eliminating the meaning of them, changing their own world. What would happen if this transportation network was extended to the other worlds that were still persisting and had yet to be assimilated by the world of laws? That would instantly break the loneliness in the hearts of the world founders and connect the world founders that were originally unable to establish contact with each other. Once this connection was established, all the hesitation and negative emotions caused by their lack of understanding and suspicions would be swept away. At that time, they would not dare to say that they would definitely be able to defeat the current Luo fan, nor would they dare to say that they would definitely be able to withstand the attacks of the many negative programs of the world led by the world of laws. However, they would definitely have stronger resistance. Not a single one of the world founders seemed to be unconfident. They clearly believed that if they could obtain the same conditions, they would definitely not give in so easily. They would definitely be able to withstand the attacks of Luo Fan's world of laws under such convenient conditions, and then gain a foothold in the simulated state of chaos. With such a thought in mind, they naturally believed that if this transportation network was really extended to other worlds, then there would be a great chance that those worlds would not have to give in. In this case, wouldn't it mean that if they could hold on a little longer, then they wouldn't need to give in? In this way, wouldn't it become unnecessary for them to give in? Wouldn't the price they paid become a joke? Faced with such an outcome, how could these world founders be willing to give in? At this time, this creator of heaven and earth had come to question Luo Fan based on such considerations. Hearing this question, Luo Fan just smiled faintly. Of course, if I didn't intend to do this, I naturally wouldn't have spoken. This is beneficial to all worlds, so it's worth doing. Fellow Taoist knows what I'm worried about, the world founder said with an extremely ugly expression. There was no point in hiding such things from each other. Even if he didn't say it, Luo Fan could also see that it would only make others laugh at him, so he might as well make it clear. Luo Fan still smiled faintly. I naturally understand your worries, but I'm afraid that you've underestimated me. If it was really that easy to break free, then how could I have gotten to where I am today? His confident expression caused the man's expression to freeze. This actually doesn't make sense. I'm trying to reason with you and asking you to explain, but you're actually not explaining anything. You're saying that I did it, and that's the best explanation. How are we going to continue chatting like that? However, such words were extremely convincing when they came from Luo Fan. As the connections between the many founders of the universe increased, they gradually sorted out Luo Fan's development process. They could clearly see that Luo Fan had forcibly torn a crack in the inconceivably bad state, ultimately changing the entire simulated state of chaos from a lone newcomer to the master of the entire simulated state of chaos. The entire process was so legendary that even though they had clearly guessed it, they didn't dare to be certain. Even if they knew how he did it, they might not be able to do it if they were in his position. Chapter 2691. The world founders naturally had nothing else to say. After all, even if they had objections, there was nothing they could do if Luo Fan did not want to pay attention to them. Since they had reached a consensus, they naturally had to take action next. It was naturally an extremely simple task to link all the worlds in the simulated chaotic layer and form a transportation network. It only required a single thought from Luo Fan. However, if he wanted to achieve what Luo Fan had envisioned, not only did he have to communicate with the many worlds within the simulated chaotic layer, he also had to be able to communicate with the entire transportation network outside the simulated chaotic layer. That was obviously not an easy task. Of course, although it was a little troublesome, it was not impossible. In fact, Luo Fan's current goal could be said to be to build another simulated chaotic layer. In order to build a new simulated chaotic layer in the simulated chaotic state, what he needed was the approval of many world founders, which was the invisible resonance. If Luo Fan was alone in the past and was in a hostile state with all the other world founders, it would naturally be impossible to achieve this. However, the situation was completely different now. Currently, he had already gained control of the simulated chaos layer of laws. In this simulated chaos layer, the number of worlds was calculated in the tens of millions. With such a foundation, a single thought from him would be enough to get the tens of millions of world founders to take action. In other words, as long as he set up the settings he wanted, the most basic resonance would be established. And the result of establishing the most basic resonance was that the new simulated chaos layer that he wanted to build would also be able to establish an outline. At this moment, Luo Fan conveyed his intention to build a transportation network. Very soon, the world founders who could no longer raise any questions began to slightly change their own worlds according to Luo Fan's wishes. For the creators of the world, they were unable to directly manipulate the simulated state of chaos. The only thing they could change was their own worlds. Therefore, if they wanted to assist Luo Fan in building the transportation network, what they could do was, of course, change their own worlds according to the direction of the resonance, so that their worlds would change in the direction that Luo Fan requested. The changes in the simulated chaos state were quite subtle and peculiar. Even though the creators of the world had existed in the simulated state of chaos for billions of years, they had many uses for the characteristics of the simulated state of chaos. But in the end, their understanding of simulating the state of chaos was still insignificant. Therefore, at this moment, even though everything came from them, they were still in a daze as to how and when the simulated chaos state changed. They had no idea what was going on. They only knew that after an unknown period of time, in a trance, in their senses, the simulated state of chaos had an additional layer filled with endless paths. In this hierarchy full of paths, their world was the nodes of these paths, or rather the stations. Tens of millions of stations existed in every part of this huge road network, making the foundation of these stations truly stable and not as superficial as a simple road network. Of course, in the midst of these countless paths, there were still large areas of emptiness. There was a vague outline of a road in these blanks. There was a plan for a road, but there was no real road. These blank spaces were none other than the many worlds that existed in the simulated primal chaos state. The reason why they were blank at this moment was naturally because there were still countless worlds that had yet to join the road network and resonate with it. Once those worlds reacted and resonated with this road, the blank areas would naturally be filled with new roads and new stations. What they needed to do now was to wait. In the simulated chaos state, there were endless worlds. Apart from the worlds that had already formed a hierarchy, the other worlds were scattered and lonely. The only way for them to connect with the other heavens and earth was through the reaction of the heavens and earth itself. This sense could only let them know if other worlds existed and if they were in a state of drastic change. Apart from that, they did not know the specifics of what happened in those worlds, what attitude the creators of those worlds had towards themselves, and what attitude they had towards the simulated chaos state. Under such a background, there was a transportation network that was trying to connect to one's own world. Any creator of the world would naturally not reject it. Of course, the premise was that they knew that it was a transportation network and not something else. At this moment, in the simulated chaos state, the countless creators of the worlds that had yet to be absorbed by the simulated chaos layer could feel that some kind of grand and vast existence was coming into contact with them. That existence seemed to be looking forward to them resonating with it, as if it was eager to connect its own world. Most of the world's founders did not pay attention to this sudden change. After all, such a grand and vast existence had appeared so abruptly, and the consequences of connecting to it were completely unknown. Under such circumstances, the more rational cultivators who had a choice would not choose to connect to it. Of course, it had already been said that the more rational cultivators who had a choice would not choose to connect to it. Now, when Luo Fan relied on the repulsive units of the numerous worlds in the simulated chaos layer to combine with the repulsive units of his own world of laws to form a negative program to attack countless worlds, there were still quite a number of cultivators who had lost their rationality and choices due to the incessant and ever-increasing attacks. For them, no matter how bad the situation was, it wouldn't be worse than their current situation. Under such circumstances, in the face of the sudden invitation from the grand and vast existence, They made a prompt decision and directly chose to respond to that grand and vast existence. They began to change their own world and resonate with it. With the appearance of this resonance in the simulated chaos layer that had just taken shape and was still mostly blank, countless roads began to appear in those blank spaces. There were even new worlds, or rather, traffic stops appearing in the middle of those new roads. The moment these worlds appeared in the simulated chaos layer of the traffic network, they felt the chaos in their eyes suddenly undergo earth-shaking changes. The originally pitch-black and boundless darkness was instantly replaced by a network of countless bright and colorful roads. They seemed to have left the chaos in the blink of an eye and entered a fantastical space-time. "What is this place?" a creator muttered. He had lost his rationality due to the attacks of the various negative programs, but in the blink of an eye, he had already returned. "I really envy you guys." At this moment, a voice rang in the ears of the creator of the world. Hearing this voice, the creator of the world trembled slightly. He had been in the simulated chaos for who knew how many billions of years, but this was the first time he had heard a voice that wasn't created by him. Before this, the voices he had heard were either made by him or came from the world he had created. Even the sound produced by the negative program was actually transmitted into his ears after it was transferred to the world that he had created. But now he had heard it directly. It had nothing to do with him at all, and it came from the voice of someone with the same level of intelligence as him. This made his heart surge. He looked over and saw a cultivator hovering outside his world. The cultivator stood on a colorful path and looked at his world from afar. He could sense an extremely familiar feeling coming from this cultivator. It was as if this wasn't the first time he had met this existence, and he had interacted with this existence many times in the past. A look of doubt appeared in the eyes of the creator of the world. In a flash, he had already left his world and arrived in front of the cultivator. Naturally, they weren't in human form. In other words, they weren't like the born Taoism aptitude that Luo Fan knew of. From a normal person's aesthetic point of view, they were all monsters with rather strange appearances. Of course, this strange appearance itself contained all sorts of indescribable charm. Anyone who saw them wouldn't think they were ugly. Instead, they would feel that this was another kind of perfection. This was the special characteristic of the born Taoism aptitude. Even the born Taoism aptitude of other worlds had this special characteristic, allowing anyone to understand this kind of perfection and perfection. "You are." The creator of the world frowned. "Don't you recognize me? We've worked together for many, many years." The creator of the world who had spoken just now chuckled, but his expression was a little strange. Hearing this, the creator of the world had a flash of inspiration. He suddenly understood why he felt such a strong sense of familiarity when he looked at the person in front of him. That was the subtle characteristic of another repelling unit that worked together with his own repelling unit. "So, it's you? It's actually you." He couldn't help but laugh when he thought of this. After confirming the source of this sense of familiarity, how could he not know who the other person was? That person was naturally the creator of the world who had developed a tacit understanding with him over the years and worked together with him to fight against other worlds, although they had never met or even directly communicated with each other. However, after working together for so many hundreds of millions of years, they had long developed an indescribable tacit understanding between them. It could be said that they had already established a rather good friendship. "Isn't it me?" The person also laughed. Although their subsequent encounters were rather complicated, and the current situation in the state of chaos was completely different from before, friendship was friendship. It felt pretty good to be able to meet a partner that they had worked together with for hundreds of millions of years. Although it was their first time meeting, they had already developed a tacit understanding after working together for so many years. With just a few words, the unfamiliarity between them had completely disappeared. Very soon, the creator of the world who had just appeared invited the other into his world, and they began to communicate in detail. There were naturally too many things that they could communicate with each other. For example, how they established their cooperation in the first place, When did the other party know their thoughts? What was the other party thinking when they first wanted to cooperate? How they were chosen among the countless worlds, and so on and so forth. These were all things that they were rather curious about. Just these things alone were enough for them to chat until the sky turned dark. After a few days, the new creator asked, "What did fellow Taoist mean by what you said at the beginning? Why do you envy us?" The other creator sighed and said, "I'm just feeling it. If I could have lasted a little longer like you, I wouldn't have had to completely change my world by now." The new creator was stunned for a moment, before he smiled bitterly. "You must be joking, fellow Taoist. You envy us, but we're the ones envious of you. If we had known that we would end up in the same situation, why would we have persisted for so long and endured so much torture?" Earlier on, another world pioneer had already explained the nature of the transportation network layer to him, so he naturally knew the nature of the transportation network layer. It was just that he did not agree with what the other creator of the world said, that they did not need to completely change their own world. Although they had already established a communication network with the other worlds, and they were already aware of the situation of the other worlds and understood the thoughts of the other creators, they were no longer as mindless as before. However, this was only a change in their understanding. They still needed to resist the negative program that was endlessly attacking their world like they did before. Of course, in theory, they could indeed rely on the cooperation with the other worlds to build defensive programs, deal with programs, and resist the attacks of the countless negative programs. However, that was only in theory. Facing the combined forces of tens of millions of heavens and earth, unless they had the same number of heavens and earth working together, they would eventually be assimilated by those heavens and earth. Clearly, even with the transportation network, it was unrealistic for so many heavens and earth to work together. In that case, how was their situation any different from the creators who had submitted earlier? Chapter 2692. Just as the founders of this world had thought, they had joined the transportation network, but it did not mean that they were worry-free. They recognized that they were not alone in the simulated state of chaos, and the hesitation and flaws that arose from their suspicions had disappeared. However, their opponents had already formed a brilliant momentum and no longer needed to make use of their flaws. Just the repulsive units of the world that they condensed were enough to suppress them and force them to retreat step by step. In the end, they had no choice but to modify themselves bit by bit to deal with the other party. It could be said that the final benefit of joining the transportation network and connecting with other worlds was that they could only hold on for a little longer. For the world founders, this was obviously just making them suffer a little longer. It could be said that there were no real benefits at all. After a few years, it was the same world and the two world founders again. It was just that at this time, the nature of the new world founder had completely changed, and there were many more characteristics of the world of laws. Clearly, this world had completed its fundamental change in the past few years. It had truly joined the world of laws and became a part of the power that Luo Fan used to conquer other worlds. It seems that fellow Taoist is more brilliant. The world founder sighed at this moment. The new world founder smiled bitterly and said, "Now, I can only find joy in suffering." Hearing this, the heaven and earth creator smiled bitterly. In fact, there wasn't much difference between the two of them. They were both suppressed by the other party and forced to change themselves. Such an outcome was a humiliation for any world founder. If it wasn't for the fact that they had no other choice, they would never make such a choice. Even if it was an outcome like this, they actually didn't lose anything. What should we do now? Are we going to keep submitting to him? The new world founder asked after a long time. Now, the only thing we can do is wait. I feel that there will definitely be a drastic change in the future. That drastic change is our only chance. The world founder's eyes shone brightly as he said so. Hearing this, the new world founder fell into deep thought. It seemed that the person in front of him definitely knew something that he didn't know. It was even possible that he was in contact with some other people and was planning something. However, he was happy to see such an outcome. One must know that he was the creator of the world, an existence that stood at the pinnacle of this simulated primal chaos. But now, the pioneers of the world, were forced to submit. Even if this submission didn't affect them in essence, it wasn't something they could accept. If he didn't have the chance, he naturally wouldn't court death. However, if he had the chance, he would definitely not be stingy to teach the existence that was forcing him a lesson. Thinking like this, he made a prompt decision and said, "So that's how it is. Then I'll look forward to the time when it comes." He didn't say out loud, but the creator of the world knew that he had already guessed something. However, it was clear that the other party was happy to see the plan succeed, but was unwilling to directly participate in it. Hearing this, the creator of the world did not continue speaking. They began to talk about their experiences in cultivation and their comprehension of various phenomena. They were both existences that could create worlds in the simulated primal chaos. So no matter what, they must have reached a rather deep level in terms of cultivation. Moreover, the two of them took different paths and directions. In this way, it was naturally beneficial for both of them to communicate with each other. The creator of the world only left after a few months. Afterwards, the creator of the world headed to another world and only left after another few months. Just like that, he traveled to hundreds of worlds in just a few decades. On the other hand, these world founders made different choices after he left. Some of the founders of the heavens and earth directly left their own heavens and earth and headed towards other heavens and earth. The way they moved was similar to the creator of the world. They also headed to different worlds and stayed in those worlds for a few months before leaving. In the worlds that they left, many world founders chose to do the same. They also visited other worlds after the creator of the world left. In this way, although each world's creator would stay for a few months, it seemed like it would take a very long time for a powerful force to be able to be formed. However, in reality, they were like a virus that constantly expanded their influence. In the past few decades, a single world creator had only visited a few hundred square meters of heaven and earth. However, the worlds that were linked together could be counted in millions. So many worlds were vaguely linked together under the influence of some kind of network, forming some kind of alliance that was not very hidden. Of course, all of this was hidden behind the scenes. At the very least, they did not directly publicize their actions, and they did not directly gather everyone together to speak. It seemed like they were just undercurrents at most. As the ruler of the transportation network layer, Luo Fan, who was also the ruler of the layer of the Lost Sky, was naturally well aware of the situation. However, at this moment, he did not have a mood to care about them. It was not only because he felt that they were not a threat, but also because there were still many worlds outside the transportation network layer waiting for him to deal with. However, Luo Fan's plan over the past few days could be said to have been extremely smooth from the perspective of the establishment of the transportation network layer and the Heaven of Laws layer. Everything seemed to be perfect, and there were no problems at all. But in reality, this was his seventh great tribulation. Even if he had grasped the network, grasped the key points, and was equivalent to a breakthrough, it was still his seventh great tribulation. How could everything really go so smoothly? In fact, as he gradually unified the many worlds, he faintly came into contact with some mysterious existence behind the simulated chaos layer. That existence was mysterious and indistinct, and its state of existence was even more strange and unimaginable. It seemed to be above the simulated chaos state, but it also seemed to be hidden behind the simulated chaos state. It was more like another layer of the simulated chaos state. That indescribable existence seemed to be gradually touched by the establishment of the Heaven of Laws layer and the transportation network layer, and began to take all kinds of inexplicable actions. Amidst these actions, the worlds that were still outside the transportation network layer and did not resonate with the transportation network layer seemed to have gradually received some kind of external impetus. The originally powerless resistance actually gradually showed a tendency to rebound, making Luo Fan feel a gradually increasing pressure. Of course, it was not like the transportation network layer, after all, where he could directly use the transportation network to go to those worlds, observe them, and directly sense them. Instead, he could only observe the appearances of these worlds from afar through his senses of the Heaven of Laws. Therefore, He could only speculate about the various changes that were taking place inside those worlds. In this way, he could only vaguely feel that those worlds were undergoing some kind of indescribable change, but it was difficult for him to clearly know what kind of incredible changes were taking place inside those worlds, and what kind of incredible, mysterious power they had formed. He could only vaguely feel that the situation was slowly getting out of his control. For the time being, this change had not yet been fed back to the rejection effect of other worlds. However, it was obvious that this was only temporary. Luo Fan could clearly feel that the repulsive effect of those worlds on other worlds was brewing a change. It had not erupted for the time being, but it did not mean that the brewing effect did not exist. According to the current development trend, once these brewing effects erupted, it would definitely turn the world upside down. Under such circumstances, he naturally did not have the mood to pay attention to these schemes that he could easily suppress within the transportation network. There's another layer of chaos that's hidden beneath the simulated chaotic state. In the dojo outside the world of laws, Luo Fan secretly pondered about the essence of the existence that was faintly discernible and indistinct. He was quite surprised in his heart. All three possibilities existed, and it seemed that any one of them was enough to cause the current situation. However, he was more inclined to believe that it was another simulated chaos layer. The reason for this was because it was in line with his understanding of the world and the state of chaos. The state of chaos already contained everything that could and could not be imagined. The existence above it was obviously something that Luo Fan could not imagine at the moment. On the other hand, the existence hidden beneath the state of chaos was also beyond his imagination. Under such circumstances, admitting their existence was obviously admitting that his worldview of laws still had huge flaws, and there were still many aspects that he had not included. This was obviously what he did not want to see. He did not reject the fact that there were flaws and omissions in his worldview that needed to be perfected and made up for. However, that was only perfection and making up for. It did not mean that he was willing to have his worldview directly subverted. And obviously, if he admitted that there was an existence above the state of chaos, and that there was a deeper existence hidden beneath the state of chaos, it would be a subversion of his worldview of laws. The flaws caused by the existence of these two were obviously not something that could be accommodated by perfection and making up for. Although the existence in front of him was only a simulated chaos state and not the true chaos state, it was still an extremely profound simulation of the state of chaos. This simulation would definitely reveal many characteristics of the state of chaos. If there was an existence above the simulated chaos state, or an existence hidden even deeper, it would almost mean that such an existence also existed in the state of chaos. This was obviously unacceptable to Luo Fan. Therefore, he could only be inclined to believe that the existence came from another simulated chaos layer. It could be said that his current exploration of that existence was not just because that existence was causing all sorts of changes to him. It was also to determine the nature of that existence, and to determine if there were any flaws in his worldview that could not be made up for. With such an essence, Luo Fan's current behavior was no longer just a kind of tribulation transcendence, but also a pursuit of the Tao. Time passed slowly. Although there was no distinction of time in the simulated chaos state, Luo Fan and all the creators of the world still had a distinction of time. After all, they were ultimately still living beings and not true sages. Since they were living beings, they were naturally limited to the way of thinking of living beings. To living beings, time was something that they had to exist. Even if time was not linear, it still needed time. The passage of time referred to the passage of time in Luo Fan's perception, which was also the passage of time in the layer of laws and the transportation network layer. For Luo Fan, 1,000 years had already passed compared to the time he had spent in the past. On this day, he suddenly saw that in the boundless darkness that simulated the state of chaos, there was a dot of stars, or rather, a part of the world suddenly lit up. From the original dot of starlight, it instantly turned into a bright moon. With this change, the rejection force of that part of the world towards all other worlds suddenly skyrocketed by countless times in an instant. This sharp increase in the rejection force directly caused a huge impact on the endless world, causing countless worlds to suddenly stagnate at this moment. In fact, some worlds even had their laws and laws directly disrupted because of this rejection force. It has begun. At this moment, Luo Fan had an epiphany in his heart. With this epiphany, the transportation network layer suddenly shook violently. All the worlds that were connected to the transportation network began to undergo some subtle changes at this moment. Under this subtle change, the rejection force of other worlds began to change rapidly. This change was extremely targeted. For almost all other worlds, this change was insignificant and not enough to cause any real impact. However, for the world that had already turned into a bright moon, this change was earth-shattering. This kind of change was not so simple. After all, it would take a long time for Luo Fan to find a single world in the endless world and then specifically modify the state of each world according to the situation of that world. Even for Luo Fan, this would take a long time to study. However, this was not an ordinary situation. Chapter 2693. This huge change directly highlighted the repulsive effect of this world on other worlds, allowing Luo Fan to lock onto it from the countless repulsive effects at a glance. This was just the effect of the simple change. That part of the world was changing from a starry sky to a bright moon. Clearly, it was increasing the repulsive effect it had on other worlds with every passing moment. Under such a growth, it was a simple matter for Luo Fan to determine its characteristics and know the nature of this repulsive effect. It was precisely because of this that he was able to make corresponding adjustments according to the repulsive effect in such a short period of time, allowing his world of laws to simulate the repulsive effect of all the worlds in the chaos layer, to make corresponding changes according to this characteristic. With this change, strange black spots began to appear on the surface of the world that had turned into a bright moon from other worlds. These black spots were none other than the destruction that appeared in that world. One must know that the starlight and the bright moon seen from other worlds were actually just a reaction of a certain world to other worlds that simulated the state of chaos. The reason why they appeared to be in the form of starlight and the bright moon was just a comparison with the boundless darkness that simulated the state of chaos. In fact, they did not exist in essence. In this way, the sudden appearance of the black and the bright moon clearly meant that there was a region in that world that had already broken away from that world. At the very least, it had broken away from that world and no longer shared the senses of that world. According to the adjustments made by Luo Fan just now, he would naturally know what was going on with these black spots. However, at this moment, those black dots were quickly annihilated. They were quickly replaced by the light of the bright moon. In just a few dozen breaths, all the black spots had completely disappeared without a trace, as if they had never appeared in the first place. Obviously, this was the adjustment made by the creator of that world in time to eliminate this damage. However, this adjustment was, of course, only temporary. One must know that the repulsive effect was always present. Without cutting off the source, it was impossible to make the repulsive effect disappear just by making adjustments to one's body. As long as the repulsive effect did not disappear, the negative program caused by the repulsive effect would not disappear. In this way, the creator of the world completely eliminated all the damage caused by the negative program, but it was only treating the symptoms and not the root cause. Once his elimination was over, those negative programs would regenerate and wreak havoc on that world once more. And that was the reality. After the black dots disappeared for a moment, they quickly reappeared on the surface of the bright moon and began to rapidly increase in size. They gradually turned into black spots and even intertwined with each other. At this moment, outside the land of laws, Luo Fan thought to himself as a look of anticipation appeared in his eyes. It'll be done very soon. With so many resources, his method of using the repulsive effect had become more and more abundant. But now he could barely do many things that he couldn't do in the past. For example, forcefully changing the nature of the world, causing a part of the world to resonate with a certain existence. And at this time, the significance of this was that he was able to break through the obstruction of the simulated state of primal chaos and directly come into contact with that world. The changes of the bright moon continued. But this time, it had already changed from constantly expanding and brightening to constantly appearing and disappearing black spots. Under this transformation, the bright moon's enlargement and brightening had completely stopped. In the transportation network, there was a certain blank space that was faintly changing at this moment. It was as if some roads were struggling out of nothingness, but due to the lack of strength, they could only be vaguely revealed for the time being. However, at this moment, apart from Luo Fan, no other creator of the world noticed this. After all, to the many creators of the world, what attracted their attention the most was the bright moon among the stars that dotted the black screen. Although they did not know what was going on with that bright moon, they had a premonition that the change in that bright moon was probably some kind of drastic change that could even change their current situation. Under such circumstances, they would only pay attention to the transportation network that they were forced to join if they had nothing better to do. The changes continued, and before they knew it, several years had passed under the senses of the many creators. At a certain moment, the boundless simulated state of primal chaos suddenly trembled. With that tremble, the bright moon had already disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. What's going on? That was the question that rose in the hearts of the many creators. After all, they'd been constantly staring at the moon and waiting for the moon to cause some sort of change that they were looking forward to. However, in the end, they noticed that the moon had actually silently vanished in the end, and it hadn't caused any change that they could sense. How could they not be surprised and bewildered by this? Who succeeded? Was it that world or that person? Soon after, doubts started to resound in the hearts of the creators of the world. That person was naturally the world that had turned into the bright moon, and that person was naturally Luo Fan. Only he could be mentioned in the same breath as the world in the simulated state of primal chaos. So that's how it is. At a certain moment, one of the creators smiled bitterly and turned his gaze towards a certain place in the transportation network. There was a world that they were extremely familiar with quietly lying there. Countless paths emerged from other worlds and directly connected to that world. It felt like that world had become an important transit hub in the entire transportation network. That world was none other than the bright moon that they could only see when they looked up at the sky. How could the creator of this world not understand this? It was clear that that person had one, forcibly pulling the world, which was originally going to undergo some kind of inconceivable change, out of that change, and forcibly connecting it to the transportation network. As the creator of the world discovered this, more and more creators discovered this as well. Sighs of amazement could be heard from all over the transportation network. Gazes from all over converged on that part of the world. After the transportation network was established, the mysteriousness of that world had completely disappeared. At this moment, not only could the creators of the world directly sense and come into contact with that world, but even the living beings in the world created by the creators of the world could also sense and come into contact with that world. Under such circumstances, how could the founders of the world resist the curiosity in their hearts and not sense that side of the world? At this moment, Luo Fan's figure had already appeared outside that world. From here, that world seemed to be no different from other worlds. However, as the ruler of the transportation network, Luo Fan could clearly sense that at this moment, that world was still struggling with all its might and changing rapidly. It wanted to break away from the resonance that was forcefully changed by the negative program, break away from the transportation network, and advance to another level. The creator of the world has disappeared. At this moment, Luo Fan frowned. He suddenly realized that he could not discover the existence of the creator of the world, which should have been extremely obvious in this world. It must be known that everything in this simulated primal chaos state was born to protect the creator of this world in this simulated primal chaos state. Under such circumstances, the existence of this world was merely a vassal. Even if the world became stronger and more complete as time passed, it could not change its status as a vassal. In this way, if anyone could sense this world, they would definitely be able to discover an extremely special part of it, the part that belonged to the creator of the world. Of course, only a creator of the world like Luo Fan could confirm that it was the creator of the world. For ordinary living beings, even if they sensed the extremely special part, they could only know that the location was different from other locations and was rather special, but they could not confirm that it was the creator of the world. And at this moment, Luo Fan, who was outside this world, was using an unprecedented method to directly sense this world. He discovered that the creator of this world, who should have been extremely prominent, actually did not exist. The world was completely round and flawless, without anything special at all. It felt like a complete world that had been born naturally. How could he not be shocked by this? This situation greatly contradicted the current state of the world. It must be known that at this very moment, this world was still fighting against the countless negative programs he had injected into it at all times. The damage caused by the negative programs was still being erased at every moment. It was obvious that the creator of this world was adjusting his world at all times to erase the negative programs at all times. Is this one of the changes? Various thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he finally calmed down. He already knew that a tremendous change had taken place in this world, and if he ignored it, it might even cause irreparable consequences. Perhaps the appearance of this world that was different from other worlds was normal. Without knowing what was happening in that world, it was clearly impossible for Luo Fan to step into that world. After all, although he was known to be able to fight against any world in this simulated state of chaos alone, it did not mean that he could remain unaffected by the absolute suppression of that world. If he directly entered that world and directly endured the omnipresent and omnipresent attacks of that world, he might be able to escape after spending a lot of effort. But it was obviously impossible for him to achieve his goal of finding the essence of the world and the source of the changes in that world. Moreover, even if he could do it, why bother? He was originally in a position of absolute initiative, but he had to cast aside his advantage and step into the other party's trap alone to find the truth. This was not something that a smart person would do. However, not stepping into it personally did not mean that he did not have a clear understanding of the situation inside that world. Don't forget that at this moment, there were countless negative programs in that world. Among those negative programs, who knew how many of them were intelligent programs? Among them, there were countless intelligent programs with the ability to communicate. If it was not for the fact that the isolation effect of the simulated state of chaos was so strong that even Luo Fan could not break through it, perhaps the world would have been able to communicate with Luo Fan before it was connected to the transportation network. Once they could communicate, it also meant that Luo Fan could even turn them into incarnations or clones. Evidently, after connecting to the transportation network, the obstacles of the simulated state of chaos no longer existed. Therefore, at this moment, those negative programs with intelligence were already various incarnations and clones for Luo Fan. With a slight thought, he slightly adjusted the repulsive effect between the many worlds in this world, causing a strange program to suddenly be born in that world. This program was extremely complicated, and the internal structure of the entire program was probably calculated on the order of hundreds of trillions. After it appeared, it tried its best to usurp the power of the entire world and instantly condensed a humanoid figure in the void. After this humanoid figure appeared, it automatically began to receive the specific will of the outside world. After a series of extremely complicated changes, Luo Fans will directly enter the program and took control of it. This is the inside of this world. Looking at the empty universe in front of him, Luo Fan frowned. At this moment, this program had already become an incarnation of him. Chapter 2694. Although the program incarnation was Luo Fan's incarnation after all, it could be said to have his will and be under his absolute control. However, it was only a program after all. Luo Fan's will was not directly drawn from his main body. Instead, it existed in the form of a puppet that was remotely controlled. Under such circumstances, This will seem to be the same as Luo Fan's will, but it could not borrow the power of his will at all. In other words, under normal circumstances, with Luo Fan's will, it would be easy for him to create a world. However, his will did not have any power in this program incarnation. If his will wanted to achieve any of his goals, he could only rely on the functions of this program incarnation. However, this incarnation clearly did not have any power. If it wanted to complete any function and achieve any effect, it could only rely on the world it was in. In other words, it could only be achieved by borrowing the power of the world. With such a deduction, it was clear that if Luo Fan wanted to achieve any goal in this world, he could only rely on the power of the world itself. Luo Fan was clearly not used to such a feeling. After becoming an innate zenith heaven many hundreds of millions of years ago, he had long become self-sufficient. Even if he was suppressed by the outside world and confined by the environment, his spirit and his will still had considerable potential. Once they were unleashed, they would still be able to unleash incredible power. However, at this moment, he only felt a strong sense of helplessness on this program incarnation. With the various effects of the program incarnation, he could use unimaginable power and perform countless methods that were unbelievable in the eyes of ordinary living beings. However, this program incarnation was so weak that he could not tolerate it all. He even felt that even his body, when he had just become an itinerant immortal, was thousands of times stronger than this program incarnation. However, even though he wasn't used to feeling weak and powerless, for the sake of caution, all he could do now was endure it. After all, it was not a long process. As long as he figured out the situation of this world and found the creator of this world, he would naturally be able to get rid of this feeling of powerlessness. The world in front of him was the world that Luo Fan was used to. The boundless universe was dotted with stars. Living beings lived on the stars, and the stars went round and round according to some indescribable law. Such a world was not rare among the worlds that Luo Fan had seen before. Every time he saw such a world, he felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity. After all, the Earth universe he came from was like this when he was born. Even though Earth had only become like this after the universe had shattered, in his mind, this was still the appearance of his hometown. Was it broken because it was broken, or was it born this way? Thinking of the Earth and the universe, Luo Fan could not help but hesitate. Among the countless world founders who simulated the state of chaos, it was not impossible for some world founders to create a world that looked like a universe or a starry sky. However, the world in front of him just so happened to be this. This could still be considered a bit of a coincidence. Even if it's small, it's still a coincidence. In comparison, if the world in front of him was not originally like this, and it was only because of some disaster or battle that caused the world to shatter and become like the universe, it would be extremely normal. After all, there were far too many worlds that could shatter and become like the universe. Compared to this world that was born like the universe, the chances were many times higher. I just need to see if there are any deeper traces to be sure. With this thought flashing across his mind, Luo Fan controlled the program incarnation. In a flash, he had already mobilized the laws of this world, producing all kinds of indescribable power. In a flash, he had already arrived in front of a star. At this moment, the entire world was still extremely restless. Although he had already transformed into a program incarnation, all kinds of negative programs were still continuously pouring into this world, destroying it at all times. However, the creator of this world was still protecting this world, constantly resisting the destruction of the endless negative programs, which was why this world was so calm on the surface. However, this was only on the surface. If one were to talk about the traces of destruction alone, they were everywhere in this world. It was the same whether it was above the stars or in the void of the universe. However, there were differences in the traces of destruction. For example, the traces of destruction of the negative programs would at most stop at the level of laws. After all, with the existence of the world founder, the destruction of the negative programs would not be able to truly threaten the foundation of this world. And the destruction that stopped at the level of laws was clearly not enough to turn this world from a complete and flawless state into billions of fragments. Only a deeper destruction that involved the foundation of this world, or even the depths of the great Tao, could cause such an outcome. At this moment, what Luo Fan wanted to find was a trace of destruction that reached deep into the great Tao. If he could find such a trace, it would prove that this world was not born with the appearance of the universe, but became like this after it was destroyed. Once this was confirmed, then Luo Fan would be able to make a lot of guesses. After all, if it was not the negative programs that caused the world to be destroyed, then what exactly caused the world to be destroyed? Evidently, the world founder would not be so bored as to destroy the world after creating a complete world. In that case, it could only be caused by an external existence. As for the foreign existence, after thinking about it, of course, it could only be the kind of existence that Luo Fan had sensed just now. It might be above the simulated chaos state, or it might be hidden under the simulated chaos state, or it might be on another level of the simulated chaos state. If this was confirmed, then, through this destruction, many of the special characteristics of that existence could be deduced. How to deal with that existence would no longer be as untraceable as before. It could be said that once he confirmed this, it would be equivalent to Luo Fan grabbing a clue that reached deep into the enemy's heart from the pitch-black darkness. All of this was now only the first step, which was also the most crucial step. With that thought in mind, Luo Fan's program incarnation directly entered this star. In this universe, stars had an extremely important meaning, and it could even be said to be the nodes of the world. If Luo Fan's true body entered this world, he naturally wouldn't need to care about the location at all. With just a thought, he would be able to completely grasp the key of this world and sense if there were any traces of destruction that led directly to the Grand Tao. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan did not enter this world with his real body, not even his will. For a program incarnation that could not borrow its own power or even the power of will, if it did not use the characteristics of the star as a node of the world, it would not have any ability to go deeper into the laws of the world. In other words, if it was not on this star and did not use the characteristics of this star, even if the deep traces of destruction were placed in front of it, it would not be able to discover its existence. This star was quite mysterious, but it was a rare star in this world that had a cultivation civilization. In this world, there were innumerable stars with living beings occupying almost 70 to 80% of the stars in this world. This was completely different from the situation on Earth before Luo Fan traveled through time and space. However, even if there were so many stars with living beings, it did not mean that there was a cultivation civilization on every star. As a matter of fact, only about 1% of the living beings in a star had given rise to a cultivation civilization. Moreover, there were only a few of them that had a cultivation civilization and could truly reach the height of self-sufficiency. In other words, there were Khanate Grand Luo. The star in front of him was one of the few. In other words, it was the life forms of the stars that gave birth to the cultivation civilization, which could even develop to the level of Khanate Grand Luo. However, they would naturally not be named as such, and their various attributes would be fundamentally different from Khanate Grand Luo. There was no need to elaborate further. The kind of star. Of course, to the current Luo Fan, the Khanate Grand Luo was an ant among ants. To him, this kind of cultivator had no power to deter him at all. It was the same even if he was a program incarnation that could only borrow power from the outside world and did not have much power himself. At this moment, Luo Fan's program incarnation stepped into the headquarters of the largest sect on this star. In this simulated state of chaos, the time of the world was relatively independent. In other words, an instant might have passed for other worlds, but billions of trillions of years might have passed for another world. Or perhaps it was the other way around. That was why even though the cultivation civilization on this planet was extremely perfect and had its own characteristics, it seemed to have completely developed on this planet itself. There were no signs of it being affected by the environment outside the planet. The base of the sect in front of him also looked extremely ancient and filled with the marks of time. Even so, he did not conclude that this world had been born like the universe from the very beginning. Even if, in his opinion, the time that this world had been affected by that existence seemed to be far less than the history of the cultivation world on this star, it was still the case. After all, the independence of time meant that a short period of time to him might have been countless years in this world. With that being the case, the situation of the cultivation world on this star was naturally of no use as a reference. Regarding all of this, Luo Fan could not be more clear. At this moment, he was completely unfazed by the age of this sect, and he completely ignored all the defensive measures within it. With a flash, his program incarnation arrived at the core of the sect. Any sect, especially a sect that had cultivators at the innate golden heavenly realm, would definitely not be as simple as it seemed on the surface. There would definitely be all sorts of alternate dimensions and minor worlds within it. After all, cultivators at the innate golden heavenly realm possess the ability to create worlds. How could cultivators with such abilities be stingy towards their own sects? The sect in front of him was obviously such a sect. Its core sacred ground was also a minor world. However, this minor world was fundamentally different from other minor worlds that had a foundation in the starry sky. This minor world was directly based on this star. The entire small world was absorbing the essence of this star at every moment, and at the same time, it was feeding this star back at every moment. It was breathing with this star and evolving with it. This caused the minor world to become a node in the various cycles of the star. This also allowed one to get closer to the origin of the star through this node. The minor world of this sect was naturally the focus of the entire sect's defense. It could be said that it was almost armed to the teeth. If a cultivator on this star, even the strongest expert close to the demi-saint realm, would not be able to enter without being discovered by the experts of this sect. However, it was obvious that this restriction was only limited to the cultivators on this star. For Luo Fan, even if it was only his program incarnation, this kind of defense was insignificant. In the end, when he stepped into the core of the minor world and arrived at the forefront of the communication between the minor world and the star, the entire sect was still unaware. They were still dreaming that the minor world would never change and would not be affected by any power. This was their greatest hope. As expected, there are traces. At this moment, as he watched the profound communication between the star and the minor world, Luo Fan's eyes lit up and such a thought flashed through his mind. Chapter 2695. Indeed, this world has been broken before. Looking at the countless traces of destruction that led to the great Tao, Luo Fan sighed in his heart. It was a good thing that he had found clues about that kind of existence, as it would allow him to grasp a breakthrough to deal with that kind of existence. However, from another perspective, this meant that this universe was formed by coincidence. The Creator's understanding of heaven and earth was not similar to his own understanding of heaven and earth before he transmigrated. Looking at it from this perspective, of course, he cannot be happy about it. However, he had already expected this, so he naturally could not be too conflicted at this time. After feeling a little pity, he immersed himself in the analysis of the deep traces of destruction. Although the traces of destruction were just traces of destruction, existences with poor eyesight would definitely not be able to see anything and might even confuse the various traces of destruction. But obviously, Luo Fan was not someone with poor eyesight. To him, no two scars of destruction were the same. Even if the same kind of destruction was produced by the same kind of power, if it was placed in different positions and appeared at different times, the results and traces of destruction would be different. Under such circumstances, these deep traces of destruction were really like a thick book to him. And as he continued to read deeper, more and more information was revealed. Information about this part of the world, the information that caused this destruction. Although it was a program incarnation, Luo Fan was Luo Fan. With Luo Fan's will controlling everything behind him and directly connecting to his senses, even if it was a program incarnation, it was enough for him to easily penetrate into the essence. In just a few months, he had already completed his own analysis and obtained many conclusions that he wanted. I see. The creator of this world has completely integrated with the world. What a pity. In the end, Luo Fan could only sigh. Under his control, the program incarnation directly entered the deep exchange process between the small world and the stars in front of him. Although the program incarnation seemed to be an incarnation, it was still a program after all. If they gave up control of the outside world's power, and matter, these program incarnations were actually invisible and intangible existences. Such a formless and intangible existence was essentially no different from the various exchanges. In this way, it would naturally be able to participate in the exchange. Of course, Luo Fan could only do this after he had a deep understanding of the nature of this exchange. Otherwise, if this program were to be thrown in, it would probably be assimilated by the exchange and be directly torn into countless fragments to be exchanged. Luo Fan, who had a deep understanding of this exchange, would naturally not fall into such a situation. At that moment, he controlled the incarnation of the program to maintain his sense of self during the exchange. Following the exchange, he plunged into the deepest part of the planet, finally stepping into the most fundamental trace of destruction that allowed the planet to be born and take shape. Although these marks were marks of destruction that had happened hundreds of millions of years ago, there was still an unbelievable destructive power hidden within. If the essence of Luo Fan's program incarnation was power, this destructive power will be directly disintegrated and completely destroyed the moment it entered it. However, it was clear that Luo Fan's incarnation was nothing more than a program. As a program, the incarnation naturally did not contain any trace of power. Even without the slightest bit of power, it was still able to completely isolate the destructive might. At the very least, it was able to isolate the direct impact so that one wouldn't be crushed by the might the moment they stepped into it. Under such circumstances, the program incarnation began to follow Luo Fan's will and headed into the depths of the traces of destruction. The traces of destruction were naturally connected. Even if the connection was not in terms of time and space, it was definitely a karmic connection. After all, destruction was ultimately caused by the same existence. Since it was caused by the same existence, any two traces of destruction would naturally have an extremely deep karmic connection. If one grasped this karmic connection, one would be able to reach the core of the trace through any of the traces and reach the place where one came into contact with that existence. It was just like how any equipment that was connected to the network was connected to each other. For ordinary people, due to technological limitations, they could only access the equipment that was allowed. However, for people who had completely mastered the technology of network connection, as long as any equipment was connected to the network, they could access it at will. At this moment, the countless traces were the same for Luo Fan. The different traces were like different equipment that was connected to the network. The karmic connection of these traces was equivalent to the network connection between equipment. If Luo Fan did not grasp the foundation of this connection, he would naturally be able to come into contact with the traces of destruction that he could. However, since he had already grasped the mystery of karma, it was equivalent to completely grasping the technology of network connection. Naturally, he could reach the place that he wanted to reach through this karmic connection, including any traces of the karmic connection. If his main body was here, or even if he didn't have to use his main body, he would only need a clone or even a true incarnation to come here, and it wouldn't be so troublesome. If he had really arrived, he would only need to take a look to directly follow the traces of destruction and see everything that had a karmic connection with the traces of destruction. There would be no need for him to follow the traces at all. However, it was clear that it was only his program incarnation that was here at this moment. This kind of program incarnation was almost like a puppet to him. As a puppet, it could only rely on his intelligence. What Luo Fan could receive was only the information that the puppet could receive. In this way, he could directly see the core of the countless traces and see the root of the countless traces of destruction at a glance. Fortunately, this kind of program incarnation also had some conveniences, allowing him to directly reach the target through the karmic connection. He did not need to take a detour like a physical puppet. In a way, this was already a blessing in misfortune. The feeling of moving forward through the karmic connection was rather subtle. It felt as if he was being pulled by some invisible force towards a fixed target. It was as if he had turned into a kite that was being pulled by the kite string. The karmic connection was independent of time. Therefore, as he moved forward through the karmic connection, Luo Fan felt as if billions of years had passed, yet also felt like only a moment had passed. He felt that he had arrived at his destination. It was an extremely strange place that belonged to this world. This place was hidden under layers of stacked space-time and existed in the depths of this world. Without the karmic connection, even Luo Fan would not be able to find this space-time at a glance. Here, endless streams of light filled the entire space-time, and the entire space-time seemed extremely gorgeous and mysterious because of these streams of light. Amidst these streams of light, Luo Fan's program incarnation could sense all kinds of terrifying destructive power filling the space-time. Vaguely, there were all kinds of subtle spirituality hidden in the endless spiritual light. At this moment, facing such a scene, Luo Fan had an epiphany. This was where the world's creator was located. In the past, when the world's creator was still intact, this space-time was the core of the entire world. It was the true center of this world. Everything in this world, including the rules and laws, existed around this space-time. Any changes here will be transformed into incredible effects that will be displayed in the outside world. However, now, this place had become an extremely ordinary space-time in this world. Of course, this was compared to the original core position. If one were to look at the characteristics of the space-time itself, this space-time did not look like an ordinary space-time. The countless streams of light were the result of the battle between the world's creator and that unknown existence. Or rather, it was formed by a part of the world's creator that was constantly fighting with that terrifying existence from the outside world. That's right, the creator of this world had been shattered by that unknown existence and turned into the nourishment of this world. Most of it had already fused with this world, becoming the nourishment of this world, becoming the nourishment for this world to grow. This situation was naturally a rare good thing for the heaven and earth. It allowed the heaven and earth to truly break free from the control of living beings and become equal to the natural heaven and earth. In other words, the heaven and earth that was not controlled by living beings below the true divine level. Of course, this was only a possibility. Currently, the situation in this world had clearly not given birth to the world's will yet. In other words, the creator of this world is not yet completely transformed into the true will of the world. Luo Fan's mind flashed with such a thought, completely sweeping away all the messy thoughts that had just occurred in his mind. After seeing all this clearly, Luo Fan already had a guess about the nature of that unknown existence. He also had an idea about the origin of that unknown existence. Tribulation level? I didn't expect that the simulation of chaos would also simulate this. As he thought of this, the program incarnation directly condensed in this space-time. As the program incarnation condensed, the endless streams of light in this entire space-time began to shake violently. Endless destructive power began to involuntarily condense towards the program incarnation. In the blink of an eye, it had completely covered the program incarnation. After the terrifying crackling sound, Li Li Pa, more than half of the program incarnation was broken, causing Luo Fan's perception of the program incarnation to become a little fuzzy. After the program incarnation was destroyed to this extent, the destructive power began to dissipate. It once again entangled with the streams of light and began to continue the endless battle. Sure enough, Luo Fan smiled slightly. With a thought, endless repulsive units condensed, and the program incarnation recovered in the blink of an eye, returning to the complete appearance of Luo Fan. This time, the program incarnation appeared here, but it no longer attracted the attention of the endless destructive power in the surroundings. At this time, the program incarnation seemed to be completely independent of this space-time and this world. The reason for this is very simple. The essence of the destructive power is a kind of tribulation. That's right, it's a tribulation similar to the great tribulations that Luo Fan has encountered. However, compared to the great tribulations that Luo Fan has encountered, the tribulation that appeared here is the great tribulation of the world. The great tribulation of the world is a tribulation that all perfect worlds in the state of chaos will encounter. Any perfect world born in the state of primal chaos would, after developing to a certain extent, trigger some kind of power in the state of primal chaos, and some kind of terrifying power would descend. This kind of power will destroy the world, or rather, it will be a test for the world. If it cannot withstand this kind of destruction, it will not be able to pass this test. In the end, it will collapse, perish, and die. Once it was able to endure this kind of destruction, then this perfect world would obtain great growth and a great sublimation. There would be a world of difference between it and what it was before. After that, the perfect world will get a period of relaxation. During this period of time, the chaotic state would ignore this world, or in other words, it would treat this world as a boundless and boundless world. However, when this world grows to another node, the state of chaos will once again destroy it, or rather, test it. The destruction this time will be stronger than the previous one. As for how much stronger, it will depend on the situation of the world itself. Perhaps it will be so terrifying that the world will not be able to withstand it, or perhaps it will be so easy that the world will be able to withstand it. Once it passes this test, it will once again usher in a safe time. In this way, after the 9th Great Tribulation, this world can truly transform into a great world. It will truly be boundless and forever exist in the state of chaos. It will no longer trigger the destruction of the state of chaos, nor will it trigger the test of the state of chaos. This is what the world that exists in the state of chaos needs to endure. Chapter 2696. Luo Fan did not know what kind of situation the tribulation in the true state of chaos was in. Did it spread to all the layers? Or was it only in a certain layer? Or was it only born because of some mechanism triggered by the heaven and earth or cultivators? However, he could see where the tribulation in front of him came from. The tribulation itself came from another layer in the simulated state of chaos. It came from another layer that was different from the simulated state of chaos. It was different from the simulated state of chaos. It was also different from the traffic layer, as well as the other small layers that were formed by the heaven and earth. That simulated state of chaos was the tribulation layer. He naturally did not know whether the structure was the same as the structure of the tribulation in the state of chaos. However, at least at this moment, in this simulated state of chaos, this was the truth. After understanding this, Luo Fan naturally understood that his next enemy was the tribulation layer. Although this simulated state of chaos came from his 7th tribulation. However, after this simulated state of chaos was constructed, its essence had already broken away from the limits of the 7th tribulation. At least, within the scope of this tribulation, it was already a real existence. All of its operating rules followed the operating rules of the real state of chaos. Whether it was the many world founders who rejected Luo Fan or the appearance of the tribulation layer, they all followed the rules of the simulated state of chaos. In other words, the performance of the real state of chaos would be the same here. In this case, the existence of the tribulation layer was obviously natural. After all, the tribulation was still a tribulation. Its essence was still to attack him, or rather, to test him. Since it was an attack and a test, it naturally would not let Luo Fan have a chance to pass it by trickery. Just like how the countless world founders rejected Luo Fan previously, he had used ingenious methods to resolve it rather easily. If there was no tribulation layer that was purely created to destroy and test him, any other arrangements would probably end up in the same way. As long as it was not purely a destruction or a test, there would naturally be impurities. For Luo Fan, these impurities were obviously the breakthrough point and the way to bypass this attack. However, things would be different with the tribulation level. Even if this level of tribulation wasn't purely targeted at Luo Fan or his world of laws, it was still a level of tribulation. As long as one stepped into this simulated state of chaos, they would definitely be affected and threatened. No one can escape. No heaven and earth can escape. Even the countless worlds that were born along with the simulation of chaos were the same. At this moment, the world where Luo Fan's incarnation was located was like a window leading to the end level. Through this window, the boundless might and destruction of the retribution level began to pour into the simulated chaos that Luo Fan observed. Right now, it was only limited to this part of the world, but as time passed and this part of the world gradually fell, this power, this destruction would definitely start to spread outwards, gradually spreading to the endless world, pulling everything into the tribulation. This kind of process was bound to happen naturally. After all, the world would trigger tribulations in the state of chaos, and they would happen again and again. Only after the ninth tribulation would one be able to truly transcend. In this way, the simulated chaos would directly generate tribulations for the countless worlds that were in line with the true state of chaos. Not only would it not destroy the degree of simulation of the state of chaos, on the contrary, it could even improve the degree of simulation, making the simulated chaos more in line with the true state of chaos. Therefore, when the boundless might and destruction of the retribution level seeped into the simulated chaos that Luo Fan observed, it would not affect the structure of the simulated chaos. Instead, it could strengthen the structure and make the simulated chaos more stable. The appearance of Luo Fan's program incarnation at this time was the appearance of someone who had survived a great calamity. When the incarnation was exposed to the tribulation, it directly endured the attack of the tribulation, which was equivalent to directly triggering its own tribulation. Although the incarnation was only a kind of incarnation, it still originated from Luo Fan. Even if the connection between the incarnation and him was not too strong due to the special structure, it was still an incarnation, and this deep connection could not be severed. Since it originated from Luo Fan, it was naturally within the scope of the tribulation. Once the time was right, when the power of the tribulation acted on Luo Fan's world of laws, the incarnation would also be affected and would also encounter the tribulation. In this case, it could be seen that the incarnation actually had the seed of the tribulation. If this kind of seed was ignored, it would only slowly grow with the passage of time. In the end, it would truly trigger a great tribulation and cause the tribulation to descend. However, just like how fertilizers could speed up the growth of a seed, the seed of the tribulation could also be triggered in advance. Previously, when Luo Fan's incarnation directly triggered the power of the tribulation contained in the endless streams of light, it was equivalent to directly triggering its own seed of the tribulation in advance, causing its own tribulation to descend in advance. Triggering the tribulation in advance required greater danger. If he waited for the passage of time and the seed of the tribulation slowly grew to its peak to trigger the tribulation, the damage that the tribulation could do to the incarnation would definitely be greatly reduced. Even if it was impossible for the incarnation to withstand it unscathed, it would definitely not cause the incarnation to suffer too much damage. At least, it would not be like just now, where most of the incarnation was completely destroyed. If it were his main body, Luo Fan would naturally have to consider the pros and cons before he would choose to do so. However, this was the incarnation, so the situation was different. It was not only because the loss of the incarnation did not affect Luo Fan's main body at all, but also because the incarnation could be replenished and recovered at any time no matter how much it was damaged. The endless world was still releasing repulsive units to this world all the time. With these repulsive units, not to mention that the incarnation only lost more than half. Even if it was completely exhausted, it could still be replenished from the countless program units and eventually recover completely. With such confidence, there was no need to say what choice he should make. Surviving the destruction of the tribulation was obviously equivalent to passing this tribulation. This tribulation naturally had no effect on the incarnation of the program. This allowed Luo Fan's incarnation to exist freely in this space-time, completely unharmed by the destructive force. Save me. At this moment, a voice came into the incarnation's ears. Hearing this, Luo Fan's expression changed, and a faint smile appeared on his face. He controlled the incarnation and threw it directly into a stream of light. The voice just now came from this stream of light. After entering the stream of light, the incarnation seemed to have passed through layers of space-time and entered an indescribable battlefield. There were countless living beings slaughtering each other in the void. On one side of the fight was the appearance of the intelligent living beings that Luo Fan saw in this world with the help of the incarnation. On the other side of the fight was the appearance of all the non-intelligent living beings that existed in this world. On the side of the intelligent living beings, there was a cultivator who was protected by many living beings. When the incarnation appeared, his eyes lit up and he shouted, "I'm here. Please save me, fellow Taoist." Hearing this, Luo Fan controlled the incarnation to ignore the battlefield and rush towards the cultivator. On the battlefield, the two sides completely ignore the incarnation. On the side of the intelligent living beings, the cultivator who controlled them was clearly asking for help from Luo Fan, so he naturally could not let his subordinates attack him. On the other side, the countless living beings completely ignored Luo Fan's incarnation, as if they did not see it at all. This strange change caused the cultivator's eyes to light up. With such a strange method, the chance of this existence saving him was much greater, as long as the other party was willing. Not long after, the incarnation arrived in front of the cultivator. It looked at the cultivator and smiled. "Greetings, fellow Taoist. This is fellow Taoist tribulation, but I am powerless." The cultivator hurriedly said, "Why do you say that, fellow Taoist? This tribulation is the world's tribulation, not mine. It came too suddenly and I couldn't react in time, so I was affected by it. Now, as long as fellow Taoist can think of a way to separate me from this world, I will definitely be able to escape. I hope fellow Taoist will not be stingy in helping me. This is the world's tribulation, not yours, fellow Taoist. Are you misunderstanding something? The world's tribulation is yours. What's the difference between the two?" Luo Fan only smiled. Hearing this, the cultivator's body trembled slightly. In that instant, the intelligent life forms that had been constantly retreating and being constantly besieged began to retreat even faster. At this moment, the intelligent living beings were getting closer and closer to collapsing. Luo Fan stood there quietly and watched the cultivator's expression change, but his heart was relatively calm. He was not saying all this to attack the cultivator, but rather to tell the truth. The cultivator was connected to the world, and it was an extremely close relationship. This relationship made it so that the cultivator could not be separated from the world. Even before he had completely given up on fusing with the world, this was already the case. Moreover, under the pressure of the tribulation, he had no choice but to give up on his independence and completely fuse with the world. If he had a 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 chance of escaping this world before, then now, he might not even have a 1 in a trillion chance. Under such circumstances, the cultivator's request was clearly not something he could fulfill. After all, the cultivator was the creator of the world. Even though he was shocked by Luo Fan's words, he quickly regained his composure. As he regained his composure, the intelligent living beings that were retreating gradually stabilized. Even though they still could not reverse the situation, at least they were no longer retreating. Compared to before, this was clearly a lot better. The cultivator said, "Fellow Taoist, I believe that you did not come here just to give me a reminder. You must have other intentions, so please speak. If this tribulation is not resolved, it will eventually affect the other worlds. I came here with the intention of working together with fellow Taoists to cut off the source of this tribulation so that it will stop in this world and will not spread anymore," Luo Fan said with a smile. Hearing this, the cultivator's expression froze, and a hint of anger flashed through his eyes. Luo Fan's words clearly meant that he was going to completely abandon the cultivator and this world, and he was going to sacrifice himself. No one would be happy after hearing this. However, even though he was displeased, he did not flare up. Instead, he asked, What does fellow Taoist plan to do? Even though he was displeased, he still had to do what he had to do. At the very least, he had to figure out what Yi Futian's plan was. Only after understanding the plan could he think of a way to create a favorable situation for himself. Luo Fan naturally saw through the cultivator's thoughts, but he did not care. He said, "Fellow Taoist, your world is now completely connected to the level of the tribulation. If you want to cut off this connection, there's only one way, and that's to change your path of cultivation." Change my path of cultivation? The cultivator was stunned, and he became furious. Changing his path of cultivation? If it was a long, long time ago, when he had just started cultivating, it would naturally not be a problem. But now, everything about him was already compatible with his path of cultivation. Once he changed his path of cultivation, it would be equivalent to changing his essence as well, making him no longer who he was before. What was the difference between that and directly killing his current self to create another him in the future? Hearing Luo Fan's indifferent request that was almost suicidal, how could the cultivator not be furious? Chapter 2697. Luo Fan's words made the cultivator's expression freeze, and he could not say anything else. To Luo Fan, this tribulation seemed to have happened not too long ago, and it did not seem like a long time had passed. But in reality, due to the independence of space and time, the duration of this tribulation was calculated in billions of trillions of years compared to the world. After being entangled with this tribulation for such a long time, he naturally had an extremely deep understanding of this tribulation. After being reminded by Luo Fan, he could no longer avoid the fact that he had always been unwilling to face. Compared to giving up on one's own cultivation, changing one's cultivation path was obviously easier to accept. Although he might not be the same person after changing the path of cultivation, it was still just a difference in philosophy. However, that was only a difference in a philosophical sense. If one were to lower one's expectations, it might be possible to ignore these differences. At the very least, if he really had to choose between the two, he would be more willing to change his path of cultivation. Luo Fan did not disturb the cultivator, allowing him to struggle and think. As for what to do, it would depend on the cultivator himself. If the cultivator would rather die than make this change, there was nothing he could do. While the cultivator was struggling, the battle was still going on. The massacre on the battlefield did not stop. The intelligent beings slaughtered the beasts, and the beasts slaughtered the intelligent beings. At every moment, countless living beings fell on the battlefield. The situation on the battlefield was constantly tilting towards the beasts. Even with the cultivator personally commanding the battle, the situation on the battlefield was already disadvantageous to the intelligent beings, and the cultivator had no choice but to ask for help. Now, the cultivator was struggling. Although he was still paying attention to the battlefield, he could not help but be distracted. He was already struggling, and if he was distracted, the outcome would be obvious. Luo Fan did not care too much about this. He believed that the cultivator would be able to make the right decision before the situation became unsalvageable. After all, the situation of the battlefield was happening right under the eyes of that cultivator. That cultivator still had a deep understanding of everything that was happening here. Sure enough, after a few days, when the situation was about to get out of hand, the cultivator finally made a decision. He sighed and bowed to Luo Fan, saying, "Master, please accept me as your disciple and teach me the way of cultivation." Obviously, he had already seen it clearly. Since he needed to change his path of cultivation to survive, then it naturally didn't matter which path of cultivation he changed to. Since it didn't matter which cultivation path he switched to, choosing the strongest cultivation path was naturally the best choice. Yet, Luo Fan was able to withstand the endless tribulations to appear here and face him directly. The strength of this ability was not something he could imagine. With such ability, it was even more worth looking forward to his cultivation path. Therefore, he directly threw away his moral integrity and kowtowed to Luo Fan, begging Luo Fan to teach him the way of cultivation. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled and said, "For existences at our level, the way of cultivation isn't that precious. If you want it, I'll teach it to you. As for accepting a disciple, forget it. If his original body was here, he would have used some means to stop the cultivator from kowtowing. However, it was obvious that he was only a clone of the program here. As a clone of the program, his power came from the world outside, and he did not have much power himself. Although the cultivator in front of him was in a sorry state, he was the creator of this world after all. All the power in this world was equivalent to his own power. It was just that compared to the power in his body, these powers were placed outside his body. Under such circumstances, wanting to use these powers to stop the cultivator was obviously equivalent to grabbing the cultivator's hand and lifting him up. One could imagine how difficult it was. As for why he said that the way of cultivation wasn't that precious, the reason was very simple. When one reached Luo Fan's level, the way of cultivation naturally became an inseparable part of one's body. As such, the way of cultivation of others was naturally a part of one's body. What was the point of being a part of someone else's body? It was just like how a person would never treat someone else's severed arm as a treasure. Cultivators at this level would also never treat someone else's way of cultivation as a treasure. Under such circumstances, the value of the path of cultivation at their level had obviously become rather worthless. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan said such a thing. The cultivator looked at Luo Fan and knew that he could not change his mind. Even if he continued to beg, he would only be looked down upon. At that moment, he could only sigh and say, "Since Exalted Master doesn't like me, then forget it." With that, he kowtowed again and stood up. Luo Fan didn't say much at this time. He just passed his way of cultivation to the cultivator. Of course, other than the principle of worldview. The principle of worldview was a kind of worldview. This might be very important to Luo Fan and was enough to become the foundation for him to become a true sage. However, for other cultivators, this view of the world was just a very ordinary view of the world. Unless the cultivator could completely transform into Luo Fan and be able to have the same way of thinking and experience as Luo Fan, this worldview wouldn't have any meaning to him. After all, every living thing had its own unique worldview. Even if two twins lived in the same environment and life experiences, the worldviews that they established in the end would definitely be different. Perhaps the difference wouldn't be too big, but it was still different. The worldviews of both parties couldn't be universal. Even twins were like that, let alone Luo Fan and the cultivator in front of him. There is nothing wrong with the cultivator in front of him changing his Tao of cultivation to the Tao of cultivation that Luo Fan had developed from the principle of worldview. He could indeed cultivate to an extremely high level according to this Tao of cultivation. However, that was only the Tao of cultivation. The foundation of the Tao of cultivation and the principle of worldview were completely different. Even if his Tao of cultivation came from the principle of worldview, as long as he wasn't Luo Fan, the principle of worldview wouldn't have any meaning to him. In this way, even if Luo Fan passed on his principle of worldview to him, he would only be able to see a brand new worldview that he had never seen before. However, he would never really be affected by this worldview and treat it as his own. Even if he was willing, he wouldn't be able to do it. After all, the worldview itself was a characteristic that originated from the subconscious of living beings. It originated from the essence of their lives and was a whole that was integrated from their understanding of the world. It wasn't an existence that could be transferred from the consciousness of living beings. After the cultivator obtained the Tao of cultivation that Luo Fan taught him, he didn't hesitate at all and immediately began to cultivate it. As he cultivated, the battlefield in this space-time changed more and more. The originally extremely tragic battle began to gradually calm down. The battle between intelligent living beings and beasts gradually stopped due to some indescribable changes. There seemed to be some special mechanism that reversed the wills of the two sides. Although the two sides didn't completely turn enemies into friends, they gradually stopped seeing each other as enemies. The other party no longer had the urge to kill like before. These beasts were formed from the tribulations, and the changes that occurred now were obviously a sign that the tribulations were less targeted at the cultivator in front of him. Of course, The cultivator had only just modified his Tao of cultivation. It would take a lot of time to completely change his Tao of cultivation, and it wouldn't be possible to do so in such a short period of time. It might take tens of millions of years or even hundreds of millions of years. Before he completely did it, he wouldn't be able to completely break away from this Tao of cultivation that was completely targeted at him and the tribulations of this world. The reason why it was so obvious in this space-time was because he had just started cultivating, but the situation on the battlefield had changed so much. It was very simple, but it was because this cultivator was actually a manifestation of the essence of the creator of heaven and earth. Since it was formed from his essence, the changes in his Tao of cultivation would be very obvious, no matter how subtle it was. As such, the battlefield in this space-time had undergone such a huge change when he had just started cultivating. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan knew that things were on the right track. At this moment, he wasn't interested in staying here for tens of millions of years or even hundreds of millions of years to wait for the other party's Tao cultivation to completely change. With a thought, his program incarnation took a step forward and activated endless power. In the blink of an eye, he had already passed through countless layers of the void and returned to the universe outside, hovering in the boundless pitch-black void. At a glance, the traces of destruction that were everywhere in this world suddenly began to tremble slightly. It was as if some kind of subtle change had occurred. It's on the right track. Next, I just need to wait. With this thought, the program incarnation trembled slightly and completely collapsed. It turned into endless repulsive units and melted into the endless negative programs around it, becoming the repair resources for those negative programs. It could no longer be found. At this moment, outside this world, Luo Fan slowly opened his eyes that had been closed for a long time and looked up at the world in front of him. The independence of the flow of time was displayed vividly at this moment. Although his program incarnation had done many things and experienced a lot of time in that world, but compared to his main body outside the world, from the time his program incarnation took shape until now, it was less than a millionth of a second. If it wasn't for the powerful cultivators, even if they were staring at him closely, they wouldn't know that he had attached his consciousness to the program incarnation in the world. After several dozen breaths, Luo Fan's heart moved, and his eyes locked onto a certain location in this world. At this moment, that place suddenly began to stand out, as if it was the true core of this world. I've recovered. Seeing this, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. The appearance of this world was clearly changing into the state of other worlds. In other words, it was breaking away from the state of being controlled by the tribulations. It was obvious that this was the appearance of the cultivator gradually extracting a part of his essence that had fused with the world. As long as this continued, there would be a moment when the creator of this world would completely recover and completely disperse the tribulations that were still lingering in this world. If he was in that world, it would probably take who knows how many tens of thousands or even hundreds of millions of years to wait for that moment to arrive. However, at this moment, here, outside this world, he didn't need to wait for that long at all. In just a short few dozen breaths, the entire world began to tremble slightly. It was as if some kind of indescribable existence was being expelled from the world, gradually seeping into the depths of the simulated chaotic state and gradually disappearing from his senses. Sensing all of this, Luo Fan's eyes were burning. His gaze seemed to have turned into chisels that fiercely pierced into the simulated chaotic state, and he continued to chase after the strange existence that was expelled. It was a pity that his vision was ultimately limited. Even if he had the ability to see through all appearances due to various means, it was ultimately impossible for him to see through the simulated chaotic state and truly find the source of that mysterious existence. Not long after, Luo Fan felt his vision darken, and then he could no longer see any trace of that mysterious existence that had once appeared. That mysterious existence had already disappeared without a trace. He had already lost all traces of that existence. Facing this situation, Luo Fan could only sigh inwardly. What was blocking him was ultimately the simulated chaotic state. When he was limited to this level, he couldn't see through the simulated chaotic state at all. Naturally, it was impossible for him to see the hidden layer behind the simulated chaotic state. However, this was actually within his expectations. After all, his goal this time was only to cut off the source of the spread of the tribulations. The matter of further searching for the tribulations and destroying them was something for the future. Chapter 2698. At this moment, the world in front of him trembled slightly, as if some kind of indescribable and subtle shift had occurred. As he moved, Luo Fan discovered that his connection with the world in front of him had instantly deepened by several times. Judging from this, there was only one possibility, and that was that this world had become part of the heavens of law. The reason for this was very simple. It was because the creator of this world had almost assimilated with Luo Fan's world of laws. His worldview had already unknowingly aligned with the world of laws, just like all the other worlds in the sky of laws. Of course, this feeling of movement was similar to an illusion. It was just an illusion caused by the sudden deepening of the connection, just like all the other worlds in the celestial of law. In fact, if one were to measure it in terms of position, the position of this world in the simulated state of chaos was still the same as before, and there was no difference compared to before. At this moment, the world gradually stabilized. The boundless starry sky seemed to be kneaded by an invisible force and gradually converged, forming a boundless expanse of land. Of course, the entire process seemed to be extremely slow in that world. From start to finish, it would probably take tens of millions of years. However, from Luo Fan's perspective, the entire process only took a few dozen breaths. That's right. At this moment, because this world had already connected to the heaven of laws, Luo Fan could already sense the changes happening inside the world from the outside. Although he couldn't see it as clearly as the creator of that world, it was already not a problem for him to have a rough idea of what had happened to the entire world. At this moment, in Luo Fan's eyes, the stars in the world streaked across the void and rapidly converged towards a certain location in this world. The void also began to gradually condense, gradually turning from a sparse state to a solid state. There were even specks of starlight appearing in the depths of the void. If one were to look at these stars from afar, they would look no different from the other stars in the universe. However, if one were to take a closer look, they would discover that these starlights were fundamentally different from the stars. The stars themselves were material, while the starlight was just the condensation of the essence of the stars. It doesn't have any physical state. Clearly, these starlight were the stars of the normal world. At least, that was the case for those worlds with stars. Looking at the birth of countless stars, Luo Fan's heart suddenly stirred. The existence of the starry sky seemed to exist in many worlds. For example, among the countless worlds in the sky of law, more than 90% of them had a starry sky and endless stars. Moreover, based on his understanding of the world, he was certain that these starry skies weren't born because of his influence. These stars had already existed before Luo Fan had influenced them and assimilated them. This situation showed that in the minds of the creators of the universe, the starry sky was the standard of the universe. On further speculation, it could be inferred that the majority of the worlds that were born by the creators of the universe also had starry skies. Why is that? This question surfaced in Luo Fan's mind at this moment. One had to know that according to the settings, the creators of the universe came from other perfect worlds or great worlds in the state of chaos. The source of these perfect worlds and great worlds was the true sages. The scenes of those worlds came from the worldview of the true sages. If that was the case, wouldn't it be possible to further speculate that the original worldview of those true sages was that there were starry skies in those worlds? Perhaps some true sages came from the worlds created by other true sages. Such speculations were nothing more than drawing circles at this level. However, there was ultimately a limit to this kind of drawing circles. In the end, there would be some true sages that didn't come from the worlds created by other true sages. In that case, could it be said that the source of a true sage was a world with starry skies? At the thought of this, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel a little excited. The excitement of peeping into some kind of truth made it difficult for him to calm down. It turns out that there are worlds outside the state of chaos. This idea was originally just a wild idea of Luo Fan's, but now he realized that he might have found evidence of this. Although not all worlds had starry skies, 90% of the worlds had such existences, which was enough to prove many things. At this moment, Luo Fan felt that his worldview had suddenly stabilized a lot, and some ideas about the state of chaos had finally been confirmed. Although only some ideas about the state of chaos had been confirmed, there didn't seem to be much difference. However, this kind of change represented progress. This kind of improvement was reflected in his body, which was that his cultivation level had increased once again. His world of laws had also become more stable and powerful at this time, and its assimilation ability had become more and more powerful. What's going on? He seems to have become stronger again. At this moment, the creators of the universe who were planning something suddenly felt a stronger pressure acting on their hearts, and they were all extremely shocked. In their memory seeds, they would need to spend hundreds of millions of years of hard work to obtain even a tiny bit of improvement. This kind of sudden improvement was something that had never happened before. Presently, the changes that occurred in Luo Fan's body and the sudden improvement of the heavens and the earth had exceeded the scope of their understanding, and it caused them to be slightly surprised and bewildered for a time. Obviously, improvement couldn't be without a reason. What kind of opportunity made this person improve so much? Was this the limit of this fortuitous encounter? Or was there more power hidden, and this increase was just the beginning? All of this, to them, was a question worthy of investigation. If they didn't explore these questions clearly and rashly launch their original plan, they would only end up with one accident after another, as well as failure caused by these accidents. With this understanding, how could they not be bewildered? Luo Fan didn't care much about this. Although there were many things he thought about just now, they only happened in his mind. In the eyes of the outside world, this kind of thinking probably took less than a breath of time. At this moment, the world in front of him still hadn't completely stabilized. After another dozen breaths, the changes in this region gradually came to a stop, and the entire region stabilized once again. After the world stabilized, it became orbicular and square. A boundless land was below, a boundless sky was above, and above the sky was a boundless starry sky. The starry sky was endless, deep and boundless, and extended to an unimaginable depth. In the end, it turned into nothingness and gradually became invisible. The starry sky was already at the top of the world in terms of orientation. There was nothing above the starry sky. Even time, space, and everything else didn't exist. Similarly, time and space didn't exist at all in the depths of the earth. There was no longer any matter, and it was impossible to continue exploring. This was the end of the world. However, it didn't say which direction would allow one to reach the end of the world and reach the barrier in front of Luo Fan at this moment. It could be said that if one wanted to reach the barrier and see Luo Fan, it was completely impossible to advance through space. Only by using a subtle method to bypass space-time, step into the depths of space-time, and continuously break through from the angle of space-time, could one truly come into contact with the barrier of this world and see Luo Fan, who is outside the barrier. This wasn't just the situation of this world, but also the situation of most other worlds. In reality, there were only a few people who could reach the end of the world and see the barrier through the angle of space-time. That kind of world was usually a world with a rather special space-time structure. This kind of world was usually a world where space had a great advantage over time. In such a world, the structure of space was many times more stable than the structure of time, and changing time was many times easier than changing space. In this way, the end of space-time would naturally tilt towards space, and in the end, it would allow one to bypass the change in time through the transfer of space. In other words, it allowed living beings to reach the end of space-time by advancing in space. Such a world did indeed exist, but with Luo Fan's current knowledge, there were very few of such worlds. The space-time structure of most worlds was balanced after all. The balance of the space-time structure made the end of the world couldn't be considered just from the end of space. In other words, one couldn't walk to the boundary of the world like walking to the end of a disk to reach the end of space-time and the barrier of the world. At this moment, the creator of the world swayed and appeared in front of Luo Fan. The whole process was easy, just like an ordinary person stepping out of his home. "Thank you for saving my life, exalted master." The cultivator came in front of Luo Fan and bowed to Luo Fan. At this moment, the cultivator looked like the one Luo Fan's program incarnation had seen. Obviously, the part of the cultivation path that Luo Fan imparted to him had obtained an absolute advantage and became the main body of the creator of the world. Luo Fan just smiled and said, "It seems that you've entered the door. Cultivate well from now on. That tribulation shouldn't come to you so soon." Hearing this, the cultivator was extremely grateful and said, "If it wasn't for Exalted Master's guidance, I'm afraid I would have died without a burial place. No matter what Exalted Master wants me to do in the future, I'll do my best." Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, Go. The tribulation hasn't been completely eliminated, and now isn't the time to relax." The cultivator was about to bow again, but suddenly Luo Fan raised his eyebrows and turned to look in a certain direction. There, another world had fallen into the tribulation of the world. So fast, the thought flashed through his mind. At this moment, he couldn't be bothered with the cultivator in front of him anymore. With a wave of his hand, the cultivator returned to his own world. In any case, there was no problem with his previous words being his final instructions. After pressing the cultivator back to his own world, Luo Fan's gaze locked onto a certain world outside the layer of the heaven of law and the transportation network layer. At that moment, that part of the world did not turn into a bright moon like the previous world. Instead, it continuously shrank, and the originally weak light began to become weaker and dimmer as it shrank. At a glance, it seemed like it was gradually disappearing into the simulated state of chaos. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan frowned slightly. Different ways of functioning. This way, it's much more difficult to deal with it. The way he dealt with that world before was to rely on increasing the connection between it and allowing him to instantly grasp its characteristics. In the end, it protruded from the countless worlds in the simulated chaotic state and then directly poured the repulsive units of the countless worlds into that world. In the end, it began to distort that world and forcibly merge it into the transportation network layer, allowing him to personally come into contact with that world. Only then did he finally resolve the tribulation that the world had encountered and cut off the tribulation. He then used that world as a springboard to invade the region of simulated chaotic state that Luo Fan could observe. Now, although the world in front of him had also encountered a tribulation, the way it worked was completely opposite. The connection between it and the many worlds did not protrude, and instead became dimmer and weaker. In this case, if he wanted to grasp the essence of this world, find it among the countless worlds, and completely target it to modify the repulsive units of this world, it would be thousands of times more difficult than the previous world.